Chapter 421. Reki City, which was raining, was solemn and deserted. Wulan State's announcement to the public was equivalent to officially announcing that Reki City had entered a state of war. The people in Reki City would not choose to go out unless there was a matter of great urgency that concerned people's lives. There were fewer military and police forces that could be mobilized in Reki City. A large number of people were needed to deal with the corpses and the wounded in the ruins of the square. The Flying Bird base, which was responsible for the garrison work near Reki City, was in chaos because of Fireman. Although there were still a lot of people left, their morale was completely low. Jiang Qianyan's move of living with heaven and earth before his death once again tore open the scar of Wulan State's lack of military power. Now in the entire Reki City, there were less than 15,000 people who could be mobilized. 15,000 military and police officers were busy going out of the city to carry out the siege plan. Raindrops fell in the cold and cheerless city. The roar of the engine, like the roar of a beast, resounded through a large block. An off-road vehicle, nearly 6 meters long and 3 meters high, rushed into the streets of downtown Reki City at a speed that was almost out of control. The engine kept roaring. The off-road vehicle, shining with a cold color, was like a metal monster, rampaging unscrupulously in the cold city center. Li Tianlan held the steering wheel in his hand and felt the surging power from the whole car. His eyes were focused and indifferent. Wulan State's choice. Rekvia's attitude. Jiang Qiansong's early arrival. The turbulence at the United Nations meeting. Zhongzhou State was silent for a while. All of this made him feel great pressure. Although all of this was expected. But expectation and reality were two different things. At this point, it was no longer a grudge between the Snowdance Corps and the Jiang family of South America, but a war between Zhongzhou State and Wulan State. Shenker, the patriarch of the Rekvia family, played a key role in it. Li Tianlan really couldn't understand how close the cooperation between the Rekvia family and the Jiang family of South America was, so that the Rekvia family could so desperately manipulate Wulan State and several surrounding countries to declare war on Zhongzhou State. What Li Tianlan had to do was not how to win. In terms of winning or losing, the Snowdance Corps' raid on the Jiang family of South America was already a victory. But this so-called merit was no longer the reason for them to return to the site of Zhongzhou State. He had to reverse the situation in the entire Wulan State. Only by eliminating the pressure encountered by Zhongzhou State could he continue to be the legitimate commander of the Snowdance Corps. Zinc Rekvia was manipulating the will of Wulan State. That was why Zinc had to die. Li Tianlan had no way out. He had enough chips in this game, and even put himself as a chip in this game. When the situation evolved to the present level, he and Rekvia, known as one of the 4 major families in Eastern Europe, had completely become an irreconcilable relationship. The rain grew heavier and heavier. Raindrops the size of beans smashed against the car window. The huge jeep turned a corner with a roar. In his line of sight, a group of military police who were heading to the outskirts of the city had just finished assembling. In the heavy rain, all the eyes of the military police fell on the off-road vehicle. The officer in the front row reached out and made a gesture, shouting something. It seemed that he was asking Li Tianlan to stop. The off-road vehicle did not slow down at all. In the state of war, the officers of Wulan State raised the rifles in their hands almost without hesitation. Bang! Boom! Gunshots rang out. A louder crash sounded at the same time. The bullets did not leave any trace on the off-road vehicle, but the huge off-road vehicle rushed up like a mad bull. The officer who fired the shot was directly knocked out. The off-road vehicle rose into the air for a moment, crushed the car on the ground, and continued to move forward with a roar. The surrounding military police fled in all directions, but there were still military police who had no time to turn around and were crushed under the wheels. In the screams, the muzzle of the armored vehicle at the front began to turn. Li Tianlan ignored it and rushed over directly. A tremendous and muffled sound of impact suddenly erupted. The off-road vehicle's alloy front deformed slightly, while the armored vehicle directly flipped to the side. The muzzle that hadn't turned around seemed to have made a mistake, and a burning artillery shell flew into the sky, smashing into a nearby office building and igniting into flames. Li Tianlan glanced at the electronic map on the car screen. Councillor Joseph's manor was in the east of Reki City, about 15 kilometers away from here. In the chaos, the off-road vehicle accelerated again and roared away. In different corners of the city, all the military and police who were still gathering and had not set off for the outside of the city received the news at the same time. For a time, harsh sirens sounded in every corner of the city. Countless military and police officers of Wulan State began to chase and intercept Li Tianlan. The heavy rain gradually became an extremely rare rainstorm in Reki City. The heavy rain poured down from the sky. In Reki City, where visibility was getting lower and lower, all the military and police officers who had not set off in time all moved and rushed toward Li Tianlan. The off-road vehicle moved forward at high speed in the city. Dense sirens began to sound from all directions. Li Tianlan's attention was unprecedentedly focused. In the silent world, the sudden noise made people upset. At the moment when their willpower was loosened, an almost silent roar suddenly shrouded the sky. The roar was like a sharp blade piercing the air, a little dull and a little weak. But in Li Tianlan's ears, it was like thunder. Li Tianlan's fingers pressed the red button in the off-road vehicle completely subconsciously. The entire off-road vehicle seemed to pause for a moment. In an instant, an incomparably huge propulsion force came from every corner of the vehicle. The violent propulsion force almost completely pushed the entire off-road vehicle out. The speed soared, and the vehicle lost control. In the heavy rain, the off-road vehicle almost burst out at more than 500 kilometers per hour in just a few seconds. Rushing forward. Li Tianlan casually glanced at the rearview mirror. There was a long tail flame in the rearview mirror. The tail flame was burning the sky. The rain in the sky was evaporated. The missile fell where the off-road vehicle had rushed through. The earth-shattering explosion and collapse shook everything in sight. Fire and gravel shot out at the same time. Li Tianlan looked back and felt that the car had become a little bad. He pursed his lips. The twin engines of the off-road vehicle also meant that there were two opportunities for carbon monoxide acceleration. Such an opportunity had just been used once. At this time, it meant that only one engine could operate normally. Such a condition also meant that if the situation just now happened, Li Tianlan would have to abandon the car. At Li Tianlan's level of strength, he was actually not afraid of short and medium-range small missiles. But not afraid of power did not mean that he was not afraid of trouble. Especially in the current situation, Li Tianlan needed to use everything he could to save his strength. This was also the reason why he still chose to drive even though he could sprint faster than driving. Because he did not know what was waiting for him ahead. In a long battle where it was difficult to get supplies, every bit of strength meant safety and survival. The missile shattered the air, and the sound of passing through the air rang out again. Li Tianlan jerked the steering wheel. The tires rubbed against the ground harshly, and the huge car moved horizontally for a distance of 5 or 6 meters at an almost tilted angle. The missile fell to the ground, and the huge impact and explosion made Li Tianlan feel a little sweet in his throat. The next second, the off-road vehicle rushed out of the fire of the explosion. Dense military and police began to appear in sight. Armored vehicles, police cars, and military motorcycles. Without any nonsense, the moment the off-road vehicle rushed out of the explosion range, the roar of guns directly suppressed the sound of pouring rain, and dense bullets rushed over like raindrops. Da-da-da, the crazy strafing of heavy machine guns sounded, and dense cracks gradually appeared on the windshield of the off-road vehicle codenamed Beast, but the car was still like a mad bull. It rushed forward and swung its tail. Under the seemingly endless firepower blockade, the off-road vehicle suddenly swerved, the ferocious impact sending the closest military policeman flying. The off-road vehicle that changed directions directly smashed into a shop on the side of the road. Countless chaotic sounds of being crushed and crushed sounded in an instant. And then the roar of the engine sounded again. The off-road vehicle already smashed through the wall on the other side of the shop, rushing towards another street. Someone in Wulan State finally confirmed Li Tianlan's purpose. Combined with Li Tianlan's direction and Shenker's current whereabouts, it was really not difficult to guess the purpose. However, Councillor Joseph's manor was originally outside the city, and it had almost become an important node in the siege plan. Did Li Tianlan, the madman of Zhongzhou State, really dare to kill there? Countless military and police officers were subconsciously a little hesitant. But Li Tianlan was really unwavering. The off-road vehicle, whose body had begun to deform, rushed back to the main street out of the city, moving in the opposite direction. A large number of police cars rushed over with dazzling lights. The off-road vehicle, whose body had already been deformed, charged forward without a care. The screeching of the brakes, the sound of gunshots and screams rang out incessantly. The off-road vehicle rushed out of the city center, leaving behind a pool of blood in the midst of the ruckus. It charged directly toward the east side of the city, east of Reki City. In the luxurious manor villa, Schenker, who had received the news, was a little restless. He not only got the news that Li Tianlan was coming to the east of the city, but also got the news that Jiang Qianyan had died. Rekvia was in Eastern Europe. The Jiang family of South America was in South America. But in fact, the two families had cooperated for many years, and the relationship between the two sides had been very close. When the Polar Ground Alliance existed, Rekvia, as one of the four pillars of the Polar Ground Alliance, naturally had the courage to make waves in Eastern Europe. At that time, even Tyrant, the leader of the Polar Ground Alliance, had to listen to him because he needed the support of the Rekvia family. Because of this, Rekvia was famous for its insidiousness and ruthlessness in the dark world. Not only Rekvia, but countless powerful families in Eastern Europe acted recklessly at the peak of the Polar Ground Alliance. It might be a little short-sighted, but when the Polar Ground Alliance could support everything, the huge benefits were enough to make everyone give up reason. Because of this, when the Polar Ground Alliance collapsed, the first to be anxious was not the major dark forces who were eager to come to Eastern Europe to fish for benefits, but the powerful families who had once formed the Polar Ground Alliance. The Rekvia family immediately sent an invitation to their closest partner, the Jiang family of South America. The prospects expected by both sides were extremely good. But who could have thought that Jiang Qianyan was dead before the chaos began, and the beauty was seen? Schenker was a little confused. If the cooperation between the two families was equal before, then with the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, the balance between the Rekvia family, which had lost its strong support, and the Jiang family of South America had been quietly broken. Such a situation did not seem obvious for the time being, but Jiang Qianyan's death was the fuse of everything. He didn't know if Jiang Qiansong would blame Jiang Qianyan's death on him. Once Jiang Qiansong vented his anger on him, the best result would probably be that the two families revised the cooperation plan, and Rekvia would have to give up most of the benefits. This was the best result, but Schenker could not accept it. What made him even more helpless was that without the Polar Ground Alliance, although he still held a considerable part of the Polar Ground Alliance's power, they could not form a whole, and they were unable to resist the toughness of the Jiang family of South America. What made him even more uneasy was that Jiang Qiansong had arrived in Reki City for nearly 2 hours, but until now, Jiang Qiansong had never taken the initiative to contact him. Schenker was absent-mindedly thinking about all sorts of things. All of his bodyguards were gathered in the hall, passing one message after another to his ears. Li Tianlan left the city center. Li Tianlan entered the east of the city. Li Tianlan was less than 9 kilometers away from the manor. 5 kilometers. 3 kilometers. 1 kilometer. Smack. Under increasing mental pressure, Schenker suddenly jumped up and slapped a bodyguard beside him hard in the face. Isn't it annoying? Isn't it annoying? Isn't it annoying? He roared angrily with a twisted face and tore his tie with force. His whole person carried a kind of undisguised irritation. The bodyguard covered his face and retreated. Schenker looked out of the bright French windows. This manor was in an excellent location and convenient transportation. It was one of the most important nodes in the siege plan. Schenker came here to persuade Senator Joseph to station a large number of troops here. At this time, nearly 3,000 people had been stationed in the manor. But Schenker did not feel safe at all. He only remembered the news reported to him by the bodyguard. The young man who killed Jiang Qianyan was less than a kilometer away from him. Prepare the helicopter. Schenker suddenly gritted his teeth. Let's go back to the headquarters. He glanced at his phone again. There was still no call or text message from Jiang Qiansong on the phone. Schenker's eyes were a little cold. Jiang Qiansong would know that Jiang Qianyan was dead. He would also know that he was being chased by Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan had not contacted him until now. Obviously, he was waiting for him to contact him. Shenker slammed the phone to the ground. Contact Jiang Qiansong on his own initiative? He could take the initiative to explain Jiang Qianyan's death, but Jiang Qiansong was obviously waiting for the Rekvia family to ask for help. And any help had a price. A huge price. Shenker would not ask for help. He would rather go back to his family headquarters and drag Li Tianlan. If the Rekvia family was destroyed, the Jiang family of South America would also suffer a heavy loss. Even if Jiang Qiansong did not take the initiative, Wulan State was not weak. Once the armies of several nearby cities entered Reki City, the headquarters of the Rekvia family would also have a chance of survival. A bodyguard took out his mobile phone and began to arrange the helicopter. Shenker kept pacing, and every second seemed like a year. There was a sound of chaos in the distance. The intense sound of gunfire kept ringing, getting closer and closer. Countless military and police officers began to gather in the manor. The extremely messy footsteps combined with the chaotic sound behind made people more and more irritated. Shenker stared at the manor in his sight. An ice wall began to condense at the gate of the manor. The thin and faint blue arc of light kept flashing on the ice wall. The military and police of Reki City rushed over one after another. The fire burned the sky outside the manor. In the increasingly clear roar of the engine, countless flames and thunder spread out on the tall ice wall at the gate at the same time. A silver sword light silently appeared in the sky above the manor. The sword light appeared so abruptly in the world. It was hard to tell whether it was real or illusory. At the moment when countless flames and thunder spread out, the silver sword light began to expand and turned into a light curtain. The light curtain surged in the gloomy and rainy sky, and suddenly fell down like a silver waterfall. The sword intent suppressed the raging fire, destroyed the thunder, and hit the ice wall at the gate mightily. Far away, in Shenker's sight, a white figure appeared in the air above the gate of the manor. The white was very weak, because the white clothes had been completely broken and mixed with the blood. But the moment he appeared, it seemed that only his figure was left over the entire manor. His figure was like a sword, and its sharpness was shocking. The silver sword light, which was like a waterfall, became more and more turbulent. A large area of the ice wall began to crumble. We have more than 3,000 people. Shenker muttered to himself, then suddenly turned his head and roared. Where are the helicopters? Are they here? Hurry up, hurry up. Kill. Outside the manor, a roar like a muffled thunder suddenly sounded. In Reki City, a thunder-shocking realm expert with the rank of Brigadier General shone with blue lightning all over his body. The lightning covered his whole body. From a distance, he looked like a human-shaped lightning bolt. His figure rushed up into the sky and crashed straight into the silver sword light that was like a waterfall in the air, as well as the white figure on the sword light. The space suddenly twisted for a moment. The next moment, the crumbling ice wall that sealed the manor suddenly exploded, and large pieces of ice turned into terrifying sharp icicles. There seemed to be an ice explosion over the entire manor. In the overwhelming ice explosion, flames and thunder danced at the same time, strangling everything. The silver waterfall was directly shattered under the terrifying blow condensed by thousands of people. The silver light all over the sky broke and turned into terrifying thunder. The messy light and shadow completely swallowed the white figure on the waterfall. Beautiful! Shenker suddenly screamed. He was an ordinary person who didn't know martial arts, but ordinary people also knew the strength limits of the dark world. It was not difficult for an invincible realm expert to kill 3,000 soldiers. But if the attack condensed by 3,000 soldiers broke out with all their strength, it was really not easy for an ordinary invincible realm expert to survive. Shenker laughed out loud. He waved his hand and ordered several thunder-shocking realm bodyguards who followed him. Two of you go and see if he's dead. If he's not dead, kill him for me. Go now. I want to take his head and give it to Jiang Qiansong in person. There was silence behind him. Shenker suddenly realized that something was wrong, and quickly turned around. There was no sound in the hall. His bodyguards still stood where they were, but they didn't dare to move. Everyone's eyes were fixed in one direction. Where everyone's eyes met, A young man in broken white clothes stood there, looking at Shankar. Shankar's body shook violently, and his heart sank to the bottom. How about I take your head and give it to Jiang Qiansong? Li Tianlan, who appeared in the hall silently, blinked and asked with a chuckle. The corner of Shankar's mouth trembled, and he couldn't say a word for a while. The ice explosion outside was still going on. Flames and thunder were shuttling back and forth. No one could see the shadow that was swallowed by the ice explosion, or whether the sword intent still existed. But everything didn't matter. What mattered was that the real Li Tianlan had appeared in the hall, in front of Patriarch Shankar. Death came. Genius 1 second to remember this website. Mobile version. Chapter 422. The air suddenly became extremely quiet. Shankar looked at Li Tianlan, who didn't know how he appeared here. Li Tianlan was looking at him. How about I take your head and give it to Jiang Qiansong? Li Tianlan asked in a calm voice with a hint of a smile. Shankar couldn't answer this question. The thick shadow of death, like the deepest darkness, slowly spread and penetrated into people's pores. It was so oppressive that people couldn't breathe or move. Shankar never thought that Li Tianlan would appear here so easily. A shadow deceived everyone's attention, and the real body appeared where it should be most. In this state, Li Tianlan was definitely the most terrifying assassin and killer. Shankar suddenly thought of a proverb in Zhongzhou state. Close at hand, the people were all enemies. He was the patriarch of the Rekvia family. Rekvia was one of the 4 supergiants in Eastern Europe. In just a few hours, his words could affect the national policies of several nearby countries centered on Wulan state. Wulan state declared war on Zhongzhou state with great intensity. Ross state and Oga state around Wulan state announced at the same time that Zhongzhou state was a hostile country. All of this was because of the orders of Shankar and the Rekvia family. If necessary, Shankar could continue to put down chips and let the other 2 countries near Wulan state declare themselves as enemies of Zhongzhou state. He had absolute power, top wealth, and peak status. He was powerful in Eastern Europe, and could do many things that invincible realm experts on the divine list, and even peak invincible realm experts couldn't do. This was the amazing charm of wealth and power. But all of this was meaningless in front of Li Tianlan, because Li Tianlan was too close to him. At this distance, the absolute force was even more terrifying than the power of a country. This was the power that could really bring him a fatal threat. You. Shankar forced himself to calm down, pointed at Li Tianlan, and tried to organize his words. Opposite him, Li Tianlan tilted his head and continued to laugh. Shankar. He opened his mouth slowly and said in a light and casual tone, I'm here to kill you. Why don't you run? Run. Shankar was at a loss for a moment. While he was still in a daze, a deep blue light suddenly exploded in the hall. The raging thunderbolts fell wildly, and the whole space became distorted in the spread of the thunderbolts. The wild thunderbolts completely enveloped Li Tianlan in an instant. The roar of a helicopter's rotors could be heard outside the window. Further away, the densely packed sounds of explosions were still reverberating through the air outside the manor's gates. In the chaos, Shankar's figure was pulled out of the hall, and someone was vaguely shouting in his ear to protect Mr. Shankar. Boom! The lightning wreaking havoc in the hall shattered everything it touched. The moment the thunderbolts converged toward the target, Li Tianlan clenched his fist and smashed it. The lightning was still surging, but all the space around Li Tianlan was directly shattered by this punch. The shattered space spread in all directions, and the blue lightning was wrapped in the distorted and transparent space and swept back. The entire villa was on the verge of collapse in the violent power, and finally, with a loud bang, it completely collapsed. Sink's mind was blank. He was carried out of the villa by the bodyguards and rushed to the helicopter that had begun to descend, but his eyes were always fixed in the direction of the villa. In the smoke and dust all over the sky, the 2 bodyguards, who had risked their lives to exchange for a few seconds for him, never came out again. Only the young figure in broken white clothes walked out of the smoke unhurriedly. Then Shankar saw Li Tianlan walking unhurriedly in the direction of his escape. He just walked unhurriedly. There was no wonderful body movement that seemed slow, but was actually fast. Time ticked by as he walked. His pace was so slow that it was almost a little leisurely. The distance between the two sides began to widen. Li Tianlan watched quietly. His pace did not stop. But he did not speed up. In some absurd feelings, Schenker clearly heard the sound of the helicopter landing on the ground. He suddenly realized a problem, and began to struggle like a madman. When Li Tianlan rushed in, he did mobilize the helicopter of Wulan State. But it had only been a few minutes since he issued the order. How could the helicopter come so fast? Put me down, you. Be quiet, Mr. Schenker. Look carefully. This is my helicopter. A hoarse voice rang out. Come on, this thing can ensure our safety. The bodyguards carried the struggling Schenker into the cabin. Schenker slowed down and finally saw an old man sitting in the cabin. He was the owner of this manor, another big shot of Wulan State, MP Joseph. The old man was obviously more decisive than Schenker. After knowing that Li Tianlan was approaching here, he had mobilized the helicopter in advance and began to prepare the evacuation plan. Schenker took a few deep breaths and subconsciously looked out of the window. Li Tianlan outside the window had become a small white dot, but his figure was still moving forward. Vaguely, Schenker seemed to feel that Li Tianlan was moving a little faster. Take off! My God, hurry up, take off, get out of here! Schenker suddenly stood up, waved his arms and roared the order. The helicopter began to slowly take off, and the roar of the rotors became faster and faster. Schenker's altitude was also rising. He still stared at Li Tianlan through the cabin. Li Tianlan was getting smaller and smaller in his sight. The tension in Schenker's heart gradually eased, and he suddenly felt a little funny. At this moment, he really felt that Li Tianlan, the young highness of Zhongzhou State, was a fool. He once stood so close to him, and he could kill him with a wave of his hand. As a result, perhaps for the so-called demeanor, or perhaps for something else, the other party actually wanted him to escape. Did he really think that he was going to win? Did he really think that he was going to die? Schenker laughed. The young highness below was a fool, but Schenker was still very grateful to him, because Li Tianlan's stupidity saved his life. Perhaps the entire Rekvia family should thank him. Schenker looked out of the window, and as soon as he laughed, it suddenly became stagnant. As the helicopter continued to rise, the small white dot below seemed to become clear all of a sudden. Sprint. On the large flat lawn of the manor, Li Tianlan's unhurried footsteps suddenly accelerated in an instant. The helicopter was still rising. Li Tianlan caught up at full speed. The speed given to him by the dual wind and thunder veins had almost exceeded the scope of ordinary people's understanding. With his charge, the whole world seemed to collapse and oppress. It was a kind of terrifying impact that was enough to make people's souls leave their bodies. At this moment, Li Tianlan was like a beast pouncing on its prey in the grassland forest. Like a lion or a tiger. Quick! Quick! Before Schenker's sharp voice fell, the white dot in the distance in his sight had become clear again. Schenker's pupils contracted completely and condensed together. Almost at the same time, Li Tianlan's figure slammed on the ground, and the whole person rose up from the ground in an instant, like an arrow leaving the bow. The white figure and the helicopter were getting closer and closer. Li Tianlan's figure was extremely stretched in the air. Like an eagle. The eagle soared in the sky. Before the incredible exclamation in the cabin fell, the whole helicopter had begun to shake wildly in the air. A huge and abundant unimaginable force seemed to be pulling the helicopter down. A sword intent condensed from nothingness appeared in the air. The sword intent reversed. It rotated and covered the rotor. Bang, bang, bang. In the dull sound, the helicopter's rapidly rotating rotor was completely smashed by the sword intent, and the huge fuselage fell directly to the ground in an unbalance. The broken rotor flew far in the air, and the helicopter, with its engine still roaring, smashed directly to the ground. A large amount of black smoke and sparks rose from the wreckage of the helicopter, turned into fire, and then completely exploded. Li Tianlan's whole person was like an illusion, and the airflow and flames brought by the explosion passed by him. Li Tianlan moved forward silently. The bodyguards of Schenker and Joseph had jumped off the helicopter with them before it crashed, and they were still desperately running. They seemed to want to rush in the direction of the 3,000 soldiers outside the gate of the manor, but Li Tianlan was in the way, so everyone could only run forward. A large number of soldiers in the distance began to realize what had happened, and a large-scale mobilization of soldiers pressed toward Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan's speed gradually accelerated. The figure of Joseph began to become clear in his sight. Li Tianlan didn't even bother to look at him. But Joseph, who was running desperately, suddenly stopped, turned around and glared at Li Tianlan. "Enough, I'm Joseph," he spoke in an impassioned voice. Li Tianlan had already rushed past him. Li Tianlan and the sword light swept past the old counselor at the same time. Both Joseph and his bodyguards lost their voices completely. Two heads with their eyes wide open flew into the air along with blood. Before his consciousness completely dissipated, the old counselor heard Li Tianlan's voice. "Where are we?" he asked in a calm tone. Bang! In a subtle but dull sound, the head sprayed blood and fell on the grass. Fireman's voice sounded on the other side of the communicator. "It's about 10 kilometers away from you." Fireman and the two swordmasters were following Jiang Qiansong. They were still 10 kilometers away from Li Tianlan, which meant that Jiang Qiansong was still 10 kilometers away from Li Tianlan. "Cool breeze and drifting cloud?" Li Tianlan asked again. "We have arrived at the headquarters of the Rekvia family, and will solve everything in half an hour." Cool Breeze's voice sounded in the communicator. Li Tianlan looked up at Shenker, who was running farther and farther away. He took out his mobile phone, sent a text message, and confirmed the meeting place with the ally he had not yet met. "Old man, let Jiang Qiansong slow down," Li Tianlan said. His plan required perfect cooperation between him, Fireman, and Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud. Every minute and every second was extremely important to them. It was a race against time. "Leave it to me." Fireman's voice was steady and indifferent. Completely relieved, Li Tianlan rushed to Shenker again without hesitation. He didn't know if there was any connection between Shenker and Jiang Qiansong. But he could be sure of one thing. As the biggest ally of the Jiang family of South America in Eastern Europe, Jiang Qiansong could never watch Shenker be killed. Otherwise, the foundation of their cooperation would become meaningless. Li Tianlan had to kill Shenker, but he was not in a hurry. Now Shenker was like bait for Jiang Qiansong. Li Tianlan couldn't control Jiang Qiansong, but Shenker was close to him. He could control Shenker's whereabouts. He could control Jiang Qiansong's whereabouts, so the only thing he could do next was to cut off all possibilities of Shenker and Jiang Qiansong meeting. Without Jiang Qiansong, where could Shenker, who had no choice, go? He could only go back to the headquarters of the Rekvia family. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud were already waiting there. Li Tianlan would chase Shenker into the headquarters of the Rekvia family. Jiang Qiansong would also chase Li Tianlan into the headquarters of the Rekvia family. However, Li Tianlan had prepared in advance. At that time, it was hard to say whether the headquarters of the Rekvia family belonged to Rekvia or Li Tianlan. Genius 1 second to remember this site address. Mobile version M. Chapter 423. If it weren't for his close relationship with the Samsara Palace, no one would have thought that the Samsara Palace would have such great power in Eastern Europe. In the Dark World, the Samsara Palace could not be regarded as a super dark force. Although they had an invincible realm expert who ranked 4th on the divine list, a world-famous murderous weapon, and the 12 supermasters of the Samsara Palace, they had no foundation. But they had no foundation. A base that completely belonged to them represented the future and development potential of all forces. Not only the Dark World but also the whole world. Only when there was territory could there be a country. Only when there was a headquarters could there be a wealthy family. What kind of superforce was the Samsara Palace without foundation? Even if the power they showed was very strong, a force that seemed to have no future could only be a flash in the pan. The Samsara Palace seemed to have never paid attention to this problem, or they had never thought about the future. The biggest impression this force gave people was that it was mysterious. They seemed to be able to exert great influence anywhere, but they had no chance to reverse the general trend and make themselves the masters of a certain area. Eastern Europe used to be the territory of the Polar Ground Alliance. Zhengzhou State had the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City. In the final battle of Heaven Capital, The territory of East Island became the purgatory of Heaven capital. The European Union countries were the areas of the Shadow Throne and the Vatican. In the extremely chaotic Northern Europe, the Dark Knights and Knights Templars were fighting each other. America was even more lively. Fantasy World Men in Black, the Jiang family of South America, and the Heroes Club were all there. Australia was also under the control of a few extremely powerful families. Even in Africa, there were guardian deities similar to Black Ghost. There seemed to be no place for the Samsara Palace in the whole dark world. They were like a force that quickly condensed into one after they suddenly appeared, wildly and wantonly blooming in the dark world. Then, under everyone's gaze, they unstoppably walked towards their doomsday. No one could have imagined that the Samsara Palace's arrangement in Eastern Europe would be so amazing. If Gandalf was not enough to explain anything, then everything that Fireman and the two sword masters had experienced during the 2 hours of following Jiang Qiansong was enough to show how terrifying the Samsara Palace's infiltration in Eastern Europe, at least in Wulan state. The whole Reki city was like a huge net, which directly enveloped Jiang Qiansong the moment he walked out of the airport. Neither Fireman nor the two sword masters thought that following Jiang Qiansong would be an easy task at first. Li Tianlan knew that he knew what kind of bargaining chips he had in his hands, but he didn't have time to explain them one by one. Therefore, in nearly 2 hours, Fireman and the two sword masters fully witnessed the infiltration of Samsara Palace in Wulan state. Gandalf has been in touch with them and watching everything behind the scenes. Their stalking seemed to have been arranged by someone. Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost's black Mercedes-Benz traveled on the road. Fireman followed him all the way. Tracking more than 1,500 meters, Fireman will definitely receive Gandalf's message for the first time. Then they overtook the car, changed cars in front of them, and chased after them after a few kilometers. During this period, the Samsara Palace had changed countless stalkers. If this was not the strangest thing, then the reaction of some troops really made Fireman feel a little incredible. Wulan State International Airport was far away from Reki City. The airport was located in the west of the city, about 60 kilometers from the city center, nearly 80 kilometers from Li Tianlan's current location in the east of the city, and about 100 kilometers from the headquarters of the Rekvia family. It was indeed a long way, but it was also impossible to walk for more than 2 hours. But every time Jiang Qiansong's vehicle was about to accelerate or take a shortcut, the soldiers of Wulan State who carried out the siege plan would appear intentionally or unintentionally. It was a simple interrogation and routine questioning. Time gradually passed in the repeated inquiries. While walking and stopping, Fireman's stalking seemed calmer. Gandalf's explanation for this was that the Samsara Palace had bribed some of the officers in Reki City. There seemed to be no problem with this explanation. But how powerful did the Samsara Palace have to be to put these officers who had been bribed by them on Jiang Qiansong's route? This was completely impossible. So the only explanation was that the Samsara Palace still kept a big fish in a really high position in Wulan State. At present, the insider, who was very likely to be in a high position in Wulan State, was still very implicit and low-key, and did not attract anyone's attention. But if all these forces burst out, they would be extremely terrifying. Even if they were not qualified to compete with Rekvia, at least they could not be ignored. With such a strong force, why didn't the Samsara Palace regard Wulan State as their base? Along the way, Fireman basically came over in his imagination. The tracking distance of nearly 100 kilometers, from beginning to end, Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost never found out that they were being followed. That was the most incredible thing. It was very easy, ridiculously easy. But it was not easy for 3 half-step Invincible Realm experts to follow 2 Invincible Realm experts. When the vehicle passed the city center, Gandalf reminded them again to change cars, and Li Tianlan's voice sounded directly from the communicator. His last order was very simple, but it was extremely cruel. Let Jiang Qiansong slow down. When he said this, the car had just passed the cold city center. The sirens from different corners in the distance whistled all the way east. A strong heartbeat sounded in Fireman's ears, with a sense of power. Fireman clenched the steering wheel and said calmly, "Leave it to me." Many years ago, he said these 3 words to Li Honghe. A long time ago, He said these 3 words to Li Guangtu. Today, he said these 3 words to Li Tianlan. Leave it to me. The communication was cut off. Fireman's eyes gradually shone with light. Gear up. Accelerator. Speed up. The car, which looked very ordinary from the outside, suddenly burst into an amazing sound. The car went straight ahead. Fireman held the steering wheel. But the steering wheel had begun to catch fire. Black smoke came out of the cab. Han Chongyang and Yin Qinshi in the back row straightened their bodies at the same time. The car approached. In just a few seconds, Fireman's car was close to the Mercedes-Benz in which Jiang Qiansong was riding. The almost scrapped steering wheel suddenly turned in Fireman's hands. The tires rubbed against the ground. The fire rose to the sky in an instant. The burning car hit Jiang Qiansong's Mercedes-Benz with great ferocity. The huge impact caused the 2 cars to crash into the roadside guardrail at the same time. The guardrail was knocked to the other side of the road. The high temperature burned the car to the limit in its rotation and exploded. Fireman, who was completely condensed, punched the Mercedes-Benz in the explosion. Only one simple, yet powerful word rang out in the midst of the explosion. Go. The flames were surging. The sword light rose to the sky. It was close to noon. Nearly 7 hours had passed since Li Tianlan's surprise attack on Jiang Qianyan. In the east of Reki City in the heavy rain, the raging fire and sword light from Zhongzhou State rushed to the supreme ruler of the Jiang family of South America without hesitation. Whether from the back or the front, the great change in Reki City was seen as the starting point of the official outbreak of the chaos in Eastern Europe. The collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance. The destruction of the Samsara Palace. The turmoil in Eastern Europe. Under the prospect of huge benefits, the whole dark world went crazy. A turbulent and crazy era often meant the death of the old era, and the beginning of the new era. When the news of Jiang Qianyan's death spread throughout the dark world, everyone knew what it meant. The collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance and the Samsara Palace caused chaos in Eastern Europe. And Jiang Qianyan, in a strict sense, could be said to be the first invincible realm expert to die in the chaos in Eastern Europe. No one was mentally prepared for a storm in Eastern Europe, which was full of ups and downs. Some people were still waiting to see which way the wind was blowing, but some people were already on their way. Snow Country was the largest country in the world, and its borders almost ran through all of Eastern Europe. From different places in Snow Country to Wulan State, the distance was naturally different. The Vatican and Knights Templars were stationed in the middle of Snow Country. The distance from where they were stationed to Reki City was neither far nor near. The helicopter roared in the air. The cities, forests, and rivers below Snow Country receded one by one. The helicopter flew very high. Chaos, the chief of Knights Templars and an invincible realm expert, sat in the cabin and looked gloomily at the vague scenery below. He had been silent for a long time. Holy Virgin Angel of the Vatican sat opposite Chaos, and also looked at him for a long time. This kind of military helicopter, codenamed Skybird by the Snow Country military, was very fast, but the cabin was not big. Therefore, there were not many people from the Vatican on this trip to Reki City. More people had to watch the follow-up situation before deciding whether to go to Wulan State. So in the small cabin, Holy Virgin Angel Mellad, the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps, Chaos, the chief of Knights Templars, 5 saint warriors, and 2 holy punishment priests were all the people from the Vatican who were rushing to Reki City this time. The 10 people were silent at the same time in the roar of the rotors. It seemed that everyone had their own thoughts. Mellad, the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps, codenamed Disciple, observed all this with interest. The light in his eyes was vague and playful. Nearly a third of the journey had passed. It was expected that the helicopter would arrive in Reki City before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Chaos's face was still gloomy and livid, and he was silent without saying a word. Your Excellency, Chief of Knights. Angel, who had also been silent all the way, frowned slightly. Under the white veil, her voice was cold and indifferent. I still don't see your sincerity. Without sincerity, it's meaningless for you to get on the plane with us. Sincerity? Chaos suddenly laughed. In everyone's eyes, Knights Templars was a branch of the Vatican. In fact, it was the same. However, as an invincible realm expert, Chaos's status was even higher than that of the chief knight of Knights Templars. In the Vatican, Chaos was definitely a big shot. The commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps, the second commander, the cardinals, the Holy Virgin, and even the Pope would give him enough respect. This was the treatment that an invincible realm expert deserved. Therefore, even in the face of the Holy Virgin of the Vatican, Chaos's tone was still direct and almost presumptuous. Your Highness, tell me, what should I do to show my sincerity? We are still hundreds of kilometers away from Reki City. Do you want me to kneel in the cabin and start to repent now? You still don't understand. Angel looked at Chaos and said in a flat tone. I don't understand. Chaos stood up. He was very tall. When he stood up, his head almost reached the ceiling. He stood in front of Angel with a full aura and pressure. I don't understand how you persuaded His Majesty the Pope. His Majesty actually asked me, the Chief Knight of Chaos, to apologize to a young man and to Zhongzhou State? In the Dark World, Knights Templars has never been afraid of anyone, let alone apologize to anyone. There was a fierce light in his eyes. He stared at Angel and said, not even once. Angel was silent as she faced the growing sense of oppression from Chaos. She was silent for a long time. Then she said calmly, in fact, Your Excellency, I didn't persuade His Majesty. Knights Templars must get the understanding of Zhongzhou State. In the case that Knights Templars did not participate in the massacre of the Zhongzhou State garrison, we need to live in peace with Zhongzhou State for the time being. In order to achieve this goal, this time Knights Templars needs to pay more than an apology. Of course, from the standpoint of the Vatican, we hope that you only need to apologize in exchange for peace. Peace. Chaos sneered, and his eyes were unusually cold. I'm not convinced. But this is His Majesty's will. Angel stared at Chaos, and her voice gradually became dignified. Your Excellency, either respect the will of His Majesty, or give up your faith. There will be another name on the list of heresies of the Vatican. I will respect the will of His Majesty the Pope. Chaos narrowed his eyes. But I hope that after I do all this, I can get a reasonable explanation. That's why you still don't understand. Angel said coldly, you apologize to Zhongzhou State. In the final analysis, you apologize to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan may not seem important to you, but in the chaos of Eastern Europe, he is very important. Samsara Palace, Sai City, Mount Shu Jade Pool, and even the Wang family of Beihai Kunlun City, and the Jiang family of South America are all involved with him. In the final battle of Heaven Capital 3 years ago, the Heroes Club, Fantasy World, your Knights Templars, the Polar Ground Alliance, and even the Vatican all had karma with him. Your Excellency, with all due respect, if you really want to find a few key figures who can influence the overall situation in the chaos in Eastern Europe, it's obvious that you, an invincible realm expert, are not one of them. You don't know what chips he has now, but you should know that he attacked the Jiang family of South America on the first day he entered Eastern Europe. Now all the powers in the world have begun to put pressure on Zhongzhou State. But if Li Tianlan survives this, you should know what he will get. Angel said calmly. Or what does Li Tianlan want now? What? Hun Dun frowned and asked subconsciously. The chaos in Eastern Europe was too chaotic. It was so chaotic that except for himself, everyone else was an enemy. It was difficult for Hun Dun to focus all his attention on one place. He had to pay attention to Eastern Europe. Perhaps, as Angel said, until now, Hun Dun had not even figured out who the key figure in the chaos in Eastern Europe was. Angel glanced at Hun Dun. She felt that the other party's subconscious rhetorical question was really stupid. Reki City was so chaotic that several countries listed Zhongzhou State as hostile. Nearly 20 powers suppressed Zhongzhou State, hoping that Zhongzhou State would compromise. Zhongzhou State was still silent. But where did Li Tianlan go? If he wanted to stay in Zhongzhou State and maintain his current status and the Li family's right to survive, he had to reverse all this. How to reverse it? If Li Tianlan succeeded, the Jiang family of South America was destined to be out of the Eastern European chaos in advance and become the first superpower to exit early in the chaos. If Li Tianlan succeeded, the Rekvia family was bound to fall into Li Tianlan's hands. If Li Tianlan succeeded, He would control Rekvia and force the Jiang family of South America to retreat. With Wulan State as the center, the sphere of influence of the Rekvia family would be Li Tianlan's sphere of influence. At that time, the Arctic Ocean Command of Zhongzhou State would definitely expand again and settle in Wulan State. At that time, because the Arctic Ocean Command had made up for the vacancy in Wulan State in Eastern Europe, it would have the strength to deter the whole of Eastern Europe, and even retain the aggressiveness against Western Europe. If Li Tianlan succeeded, all this belonged to him, the Li family and Zhongzhou State. Whether it was vested interests or strategic prospects, they were extremely wonderful. It was precisely because Zhongzhou State saw this that it kept silent and waited for Li Tianlan's result in Reki City. Li Tianlan had the support of Samsara Palace. He held too many chips in his hand. At the very least, he had the sword that was destined to shock the world behind him. The Vatican could not see the possibility of his failure. If Li Tianlan had determined his position in Wulan State, and the Jiang family of South America had withdrawn, his next target would definitely be Knights Templars and the Vatican behind Knights Templars. The Vatican was not afraid of Li Tianlan, nor of Zhongzhou State. But now the Vatican needed the sword of Samsara Palace. This was the real top priority. So they needed Knights Templars to reach an agreement with Li Tianlan, even if they had to pay more than an apology. This or something else, at some important moments, even including the cultivation and life of chaos, an invincible realm expert. This matter was extremely important. In the Vatican's plan, this was even one of the most important things. But this matter was also very complicated. Angel thought about it and tried to say as simply as possible. Simply put, if Li Tianlan succeeds, he will get Wulan State as the core, the military power of the 5 nearby countries. With Wulan State as the core, the military power of the 5 nearby countries. Although the countries around Wulan State were very small, but in terms of land area, Wulan State was the second largest country in Europe except for Snow Country. Once this plan succeeded, it could even affect the transfer of the entire Arctic Ocean Command of Zhongzhou State. At that time, the army of Zhongzhou State occupied Wulan State. Chaos's face became more and more ugly. But Angel was not finished yet. From a certain secret cooperation, our obligation this time may not only be to apologize, but also to help Li Tianlan get the military power of the 5 countries. What about us? Chaos sneered and said, what can we get? His Majesty the Pope's will is that Li Tianlan can get the military power. But the Vatican must get the divine power. Angel said. The Vatican was on the way. The Shadow Throne was also on the way. When many people were paying attention to Jiang Qiansong, only the Shadow Throne was paying attention to Black Ghost, who was known as the guardian deity of Africa. Like the Polar Ground Alliance, the Shadow Throne was also an extremely strange superpower. There were similarities between the two, but they were not exactly the same. The leader of the Polar Ground Alliance was supported by the 4 major families in Eastern Europe, and then established by the support of the major families in Eastern Europe. However, there was only one surname on the throne of the Shadow Throne for hundreds of years. That was Rothschild, a super ancient wealthy family with a longer history than the Wang family of Beihai. The Shadow Throne was also composed of the major families in Europe, but at the same time, it was the guardian of the European Union. The meaning of this position was extremely broad. It meant that it was absolutely fair and neutral within the European Union, but it also had countless invisible power and glory. The Shadow Throne guarded the entire European Union. The status of the wealthy families under the throne was naturally stable within the European Union. This close relationship of mutual cooperation and interdependence was far more mature than that of the Polar Ground Alliance. If the Polar Ground Alliance continued to develop, it might also become an organization like the Shadow Throne. At that time, there would be 2 superpowers in Europe, one occupying Eastern Europe and the other occupying Western Europe. It would be a magnificent scene. However, within the Polar Ground Alliance, where even the leader did not have much dominance, the game between the leader and the 4 major families, and the entanglement between the major families in various countries, made all of this extremely complicated. The Polar Ground Alliance could only become more and more bloated and chaotic, and eventually collapse completely. The Shadow Throne came to Eastern Europe from Western Europe this time, and had basically secretly obtained the consent of the majority of the European Union countries. Almost all countries in Western Europe hoped to completely turn Europe into the world of the Shadow Throne. This was destined to spur the formation of an unprecedented behemoth in the Dark World. However, such a behemoth meant stability in the political system of Western Europe, which was far more mature than that of Eastern Europe. However, in the Shadow Throne, although Rothschild had enough dominance, Grand Duke Irene Qingtong Wang Rothschild, known as the Shadow Queen, also needed to make a choice between the interests of the major countries and the interests of the major wealthy families. The major countries of the European Union hoped that the Queen of Shadows could let the shadow cover Eastern Europe. This was destined to be a long, complicated, and tortuous process. However, the major families in the Shadow Throne unanimously asked the Queen to kill the Black Ghost in Africa. This process might be short, but it would not be easy. A few years ago, the Black Ghost suddenly appeared in Africa. In a very short time, the major families in the Shadow Throne suffered heavy losses in the hands of the Black Ghost. Africa was very down and out, but it was not barren. It was a land full of gold. The major families suffered heavy losses in Africa, and the benefits they represented were simply unimaginable. However, the Black Ghost had a very deep foundation in Africa. He was known as the guardian deity, and he had won the support of dozens of indigenous tribes in Africa. He had a great momentum, and there was a vague intention to compete with the African Divine Martial Army. Everyone knew that the Divine Martial Army's backer was the Wang family of Beihai, but no one knew if the Black Ghost also knew it. However, the Black Ghost had never had too much friction with the Divine Martial Army. What he wanted seemed to be benefits. So the wealthy families in the Shadow Throne were plundered by him one by one. In the past few years, the two sides had fought countless times, and the hatred had become deeper and deeper. It had gradually become an inextricable knot. In particular, in the past 2 years, the two sides had fought with each other for real. Black Ghost was constantly growing, but the benefits of the major families in the Shadow Throne in some parts of Africa were close to zero. Capitalists hated others to touch their cake the most. What's more, it was such a big cake like Africa. Now the Black Ghost appeared in Eastern Europe. Many wealthy families in the Shadow Throne had decided to kill the Black Ghost in Eastern Europe. As for the Jiang family of South America, they were opponents anyway. If they could kill him, it would be good. Qingtong also thought it was good. So as soon as she knew that the Black Ghost appeared, she had already set off for Reki City. Reki City seemed to have become the focus of Eastern Europe overnight. For Qingtong, the Black Ghost was there and he had to die. And in the current situation, the Snowdance Corps and the Jiang family of South America were fighting endlessly in Reki City, and the Rekvia family and Wulan state were likely to change their positions at any time. Their positions might be the same as those of the Jiang family of South America, but if Li Tianlan won, they would also surrender to Li Tianlan helplessly. Such a swing also meant that if the Shadow Throne finally established the situation in Reki City, Rekvia and Wulan state would maintain the same position as the Shadow Throne. This was the helplessness after the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance. Morton, Violet, the Qin family, and Rekvia. The 4 major families in Eastern Europe supported the Polar Ground Alliance. The first 3 were better, but Rekvia was recognized as the weakest of the 4 major families. In the case that they did not support Tyrant, the Polar Ground Alliance collapsed. At the critical moment, Tyrant could not support them. This was an opportunity for everyone. Rekvia. The helicopter was flying fast in the air. The golden pupils of the Queen of Shadows gradually lit up, becoming more and more enchanting. She suddenly felt that it was indeed a good choice to put the breakthrough in Eastern Europe in Rekvia. No, it was even the best choice. Was it because Li Tianlan saw this that he chose to attack the Jiang family of South America and involve Rekvia and Wulan state at the same time? If there was a plan in advance, then he could certainly predict the current situation now. How could he not be prepared for the current situation? Qingtong frowned. Thinking of this problem, she suddenly felt a little uneasy, but she also had some fighting spirit. The chaos in all of Eastern Europe seemed to be getting more and more interesting. Let's speed up. Standing on the helicopter, Qingtong suddenly ordered. The helicopter gradually accelerated in the air. Through the cabin, King Tong looked into the distance. The Shadow Throne was different from any other force. They entered Eastern Europe, but for the time being, they did not choose to join forces with any major force in Eastern Europe. The allies they had identified in private were outside Eastern Europe, but they were very close to Eastern Europe. The Wang family of Beihai. This also meant that the Shadow Throne's next action might become the enemy of all the forces in Eastern Europe. It also meant that the Shadow Throne had the possibility of becoming an ally of any force in Eastern Europe. King Tong vaguely sensed a series of variables that were about to form in Eastern Europe after the dust settled in Wulan state. Her golden pupils grew deeper and more enchanting. A storm was brewing in Eastern Europe. What was an enemy or a friend? Genius 1 second to remember the address of this website. Mobile version M. Chapter 424. The fire burned the curtain of rain. At the moment when the black Mercedes-Benz collided and exploded, Fireman's burning fist almost covered most of the street. Flowing fire. Violent fire. The heavy rain did not evaporate in the fire. Under the sky, water and fire seemed to be completely connected. So the fire was no longer burning, but turned into a magma-like liquid. The surging waves directly covered with unimaginable heat and high temperature. The sword light surged into the wind in the magma. Light and darkness were yin and yang. Ice and fire were also yin and yang. On the street of Reki City, the moment Fireman and the two sword masters attacked, the distance between the three of them was so close. Vaguely, the power and sword intent between the three seemed to have completely condensed together. In Zhongzhou state, this was a relatively common sword formation. Countless ordinary soldiers and ordinary special warfare personnel could use the sword formation. It was not exquisite and belonged to a very basic sword formation, the three elements formation. But at this moment, this was a sword formation composed of three superiors of the half-step invincible realm. The surging magma suddenly covered the whole street. The magma burned everything, but it solidified the moment it flowed. Only the sword intent traveled through the solidified sea of fire. Wherever the sword intent passed, ice and snow began to appear in the sea of fire. Under the fusion of the piercing cold and boiling heat, the whole world seemed to become extremely fragile, and a large area of space began to shatter in the two very different temperatures. The three elements formation changed quietly. Han Chongyang, the yin and yang sword master, directly replaced Fireman's position and stabbed straight with his sword. Yin and yang sword, yin and yang impermanence. The solidified fire and the frozen ice all burst with this sword. The whole street was almost completely occupied by the surging sword energy in the blink of an eye. The raging fire, ice, wind, and snow kept colliding and exploding in the completely torn space, and the huge force completely smashed the overturned Mercedes-Benz. The yin and yang sword intent did not dissipate, but became more and more powerful. The two sword intents reincarnated repeatedly, as if they would never stop. Han Chongyang stood in the front. Fireman and Yin Qinshi stood on the left and right. As Han Chongyang stabbed forward with his sword, the three moved forward at the same time. The surging ice and fire were completely compressed as the yin and yang sword moved forward. The three of them were no more than 20 meters away from the overturned Mercedes-Benz. In the blink of an eye, the tip of the yin-yang sword had already pierced in the direction where Benz had originally been. There was no surging ice and fire, no circulating sword intent. Only a void. This empty space was so out of place with its surroundings, so it naturally became the target of all the sword chi, ice, and fire attacks. The sharp edge of the yin-yang sword stabbed into the dark and calm hollow, as if it had stabbed into the real object of the sword shadow. Han Chongyang's arm muscles trembled. In the three talents formation, the strength of the three overlapped. The power of this sword was far beyond Han Chongyang's peak state. The yin-yang sword that had been passed down in Mount Shu for hundreds of years seemed to be unable to bear the power of this sword. The slender sword edge began to bend slightly in the trembling. The hole that was being stared at by the sword began to glow, and the blurry space began to become round, looking like a transparent ball. The sphere began to expand under the pressure of the sword tip. The edge of the yin-yang sword began to bend. Han Chongyang's face suddenly changed. As he took a step back, Fireman took his place at the same time with great tacit understanding and punched it directly with all his strength. This punch did not bring any raging fire, but the wind of the fist seemed to collapse the space along the way. In the terrible roaring sound of the wind and thunder, Fireman's fist turned fiery red. Boom! The clenched fist slammed into the expanding transparent ball. Half of the street seemed to shake with a rumble. The dark and round sphere was no longer expanding, but the inside shone with a dazzling light. The pure light swelled in the round sphere, and two figures slowly came out of the endless light. Jiang Qiansong, Black Ghost, Fireman, and the two sword masters both recognized the two targets. At the same time, they also recognized this unique skill. This was the unique skill that Jiang Qianyan had just used not long ago. 30-meter Mortal World, Radiant Temple. The three figures moved at the same time. In the center of the light, Jiang Qiansong had raised his hand casually. The space shook fiercely for a moment. The light and the spherical domain around him expanded at the same time, enveloping Fireman and the two sword masters. The next second, the whole domain began to shrink with endless light. The three figures were first unbalanced in the shrinking domain, and then out of control. Involuntarily, Jiang Qiansong rushed over. Black Ghost grinned and pulled out a jet-black short knife. At the moment when the 30-meter Mortal World domain shrank, Black Ghost waved the short knife in his hand directly. A piece of black and sharp knife light appeared directly in the domain of the 30-meter Mortal World, which was so dazzling in the pure light. This was pure power and killing intent, with unparalleled savagery and madness. The knife light flashed and passed through Fireman's body. Then it was Han Chongyang and Yun Qinshi. The bodies of the three turned into pieces the moment they touched the knife light. Black Ghost froze for a moment. Jiang Qiansong frowned slightly and opened his palm subconsciously. The light faded around him, and the domain disappeared. The figures of Fireman and the two sword masters reappeared in the sight of the two invincible realm experts. From beginning to end, the three of them had never been pulled into the domain of the 30-meter Mortal World. Everything just now was just an illusion. Phantom sword? Yin-yang sword? Jiang Qiansong raised his eyebrows. He said the sword of Mount Shu, but his sharp eyes were fixed on Fireman. The corners of his mouth twitched. In a trance, he seemed to feel the unforgettable smell from many years ago. Jiang Qiansong's palms clenched into fists. But in terms of scheming, the dominator of the Jiang family of South America was indeed far better than Jiang Qianyan. Even when he remembered the humiliation he had received, his tone was still calm. You killed Qianyan? Fireman didn't speak, just reached out and rubbed his crotch. This action carried an obvious hint. After all, both Jiang Qianyan and Jiang Qiansong had said that Uncle Fire's urine was delicious. Jiang Qiansong's eyes suddenly twisted for a moment, and became extremely ferocious. He took a deep breath, slowly turned around, and said to Black Ghost, "Kill them." Before he finished speaking, a jet-black saber light had already flashed through the world in the curtain of rain. Black Ghost drew his knife and rushed forward. In an instant, his figure was infinitely close to Fireman and the two sword masters. The invincible Black Ghost, who had never been on the divine and holy lists, but had given the Shadow Throne a headache in Africa, showed his full edge for the first time in Eastern Europe. Fast. The unparalleled rapidity made Black Ghost sprint with an extremely wild impact and penetrating power. The black knife in his hand was waved 100 meters away. Before the knife reached its apex, he had rushed out nearly 100 meters. The black knife and the black man. With one step, he directly tore a dark tide of nearly 100 meters in the street. The sword light of the yin-yang sword and the phantom sword completely overlapped. The raging fire in Fireman's hands continued to gather. The fire condensed together and turned into magma. The magma slowly solidified and turned into a wall of fire standing between the three of them. The yin and yang sword intent and the phantom sword intent were superimposed at the same time. The ice began to gather inside the wall of fire, and the phantom sword intent enveloped the wall of fire. For a time, there were several walls of fire that were hard to distinguish between real and fake on the street. Black Ghost had rushed over. Phantom ice raging fire? He didn't care at all. One knife. The black knife cut through the air, with a whistling sound like a hurricane. 100-meter-long knife light directly slashed on the phantom wall of fire. Under the heavy rain, the flowing fire suddenly flew up with the sword energy. The wall of fire was completely smashed under the knife, and the sword intent collapsed in the air. Fireman, Han Chongyang, and Yun Qinshi were sent flying by this knife at the same time. Black Ghost's body stagnated for a moment, and a paleness flashed across his dark face. He withdrew his knife and rushed forward. His whole body's essence, chi, and spirit were completely locked on Fireman in an instant. His figure rushed over directly with the darkness, and he punched Fireman's head hard. Fireman, whose eyes were solemn and focused, raised his head. The raging fire suddenly rose as he raised his head. Black Ghost punched. Fireman was also punching. The boundless fire condensed into a huge flame fist shadow in the darkness around Black Ghost. Black Ghost rushed down with a roar and punched the flame fist shadow with the dark domain. The huge fist shadow collapsed completely, and the two men's arms collided fiercely. Kacha! With a crisp sound, Fireman spat out a mouthful of blood directly. With his broken arm, he was instantly blown away by this punch. Black Ghost also spat out a mouthful of blood, but his eyes became wilder. Fireman, who was blown away, was supported by Han Chongyang. The severe pain of his broken arm made the muscles on his face twitch. His breath began to weaken, and he looked down at his broken arm. There were no words to describe his emotions and eyes at this moment. If he could be 10 years younger. No, 5 years. Even if he could go back to the time when Li Tianlan first went to the desert prison more than 3 years ago, Fireman was sure to kill Black Ghost. He had a future that was countless times more brilliant than it was now. He had the safest road to the invincible realm. And he had the talent of martial arts that amazed the whole Zhongzhou state. But now all of this was ruined. It was ruined in time in the prison, and in the turbulent and insidious power game. Fireman's body trembled slightly, and he struggled to move forward again. Elder Hua. Han Chongyang pulled him and said, "Let me do it." "The other party is not as strong as he looks," Fireman whispered. "His defense is very poor." Black Ghost was indeed in the invincible realm, but his invincible realm was extremely special. To some extent, the Jiang family of South America did not cultivate experts in the invincible realm, but invincible realm weapons that could cooperate with the Jiang family of South America. Black Ghost's attack power was undoubtedly at the level of the divine list, but his defense was not even as good as that of the ordinary half-step invincible realm, which was his most fatal flaw. If he could be 2 years younger, or any top half-step invincible realm expert was here, such as Li Tianlan, then the possibility of killing Black Ghost was absolutely there. "Let me do it." Fireman took a deep breath and broke free from Han Chongyang's hand. His eyes were like two wildfires that refused to be extinguished, determined and crazy. "I'll leave the rest to you." This sentence was not only for Han Chongyang and Yun Qinshi. It was also for Li Tianlan, Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud. "No need." Li Tianlan's calm voice suddenly sounded in the communication channel. Fireman froze for a moment. Boom. A violent explosion suddenly sounded on the street. Da-da-da, bang. Who? All kinds of chaotic sounds kept ringing after the explosion. It was not only Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost. Even the faces of Fireman and the two sword masters changed dramatically. There was a sharp whistling sound and a suspenseful turning sound in the air. The sound of the tracks rubbing against the ground approached quickly, along with messy footsteps and clear and powerful orders. Jiang Qiansong, Black Ghost, Fireman, Yun Qinshi, Han Chongyang. The same picture appeared in everyone's eyes. The dense army, the advancing main battle tanks, the soaring fighter planes and the hovering helicopters. For a time, a torrent of firepower blanketed the entire block. Bullets, cannonballs, rocket launchers. The whole block turned into ruins in just a few seconds. But the dense firepower was still pouring out wantonly, regardless of the enemy or friend. Or from the standpoint of Wulan State, whether it was Fireman or Jiang Qiansong, they were all enemies. The explosions that were enough to destroy everything kept ringing. The dense firepower covered every inch of land. Large tracts of buildings slowly fell down and black smoke rose. In the smoke and dust all over the sky, everyone's sight was filled with destructive artillery fire. The artillery fire was endless. It fell resolutely and fiercely more and more. Experts could indeed resist the impact of a lot of modern artillery fire. But being able to resist a lot was not the same concept as resisting all of them. The invincible realm was also a body of flesh and blood. Not to mention missiles and machine guns. Even if thousands of people kept shooting with the least powerful pistols, the invincible realm experts would not be able to bear it after a long time. In the almost earth-shattering firepower, the domain of the invincible realm, the sword intent of Mount Shu, and the raging fire of Fireman were all madly consuming. Fireman took the two sword masters to stop the two invincible realm experts of the Jiang family of South America. This was an almost impossible task, especially the two invincible realm experts whose shortcomings could completely complement each other. One of the most important prerequisites for the three of them to carry out this task was the cooperation of the Samsara Palace's forces in Eastern Europe. Fireman was almost sure that the Samsara Palace had raised a big fish in the military of Wulan State, an absolutely powerful big fish. Now, with a flick of the big fish's tail, the sky was filled with artillery fire that covered the entire street, regardless of friend or foe. Was this the so-called fucking cooperation? Fireman cursed in a low voice. Old man, don't talk nonsense, retreat quickly. Li Tianlan said in a hurry. This kind of indiscriminate attack was indeed cruel, but it was the only way. The battlefield full of artillery fire could indeed pose a fatal threat to Fireman and the others. But such a threat seemed so insignificant compared to the threat brought to them by Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost. In contrast, such a degree of artillery fire coverage was completely equivalent to providing the perfect cover for Fireman and the others. You three, turn left at the second intersection ahead, and someone will pick you up to leave the battlefield. Gandalf's voice suddenly sounded with a deep smile. As for this block, it is destined to be covered by artillery fire for a long time. Fireman's heart skipped a beat. He turned around and ran forward. As long as someone picked them up to leave here, the intensive artillery fire was equivalent to Li Tianlan giving Jiang Qiansong a choice. A choice without a choice. He could not choose to stand here under the artillery fire of Reki City and eventually die here. He could only choose to break through. To break through, he had to kill. Kill the people of Reki City. Chapter 425. Amidst the general trend, there were brilliant conspiracies, unimaginable ways of doing things, cheerful and witty strategizing, bold and unconstrained analysis and planning. These were all important, but not the most important. The most important game didn't matter if it was wonderful or not. Real schemers never cared about other people's evaluation. The original intention of anyone who laid out the game was not to gain others' admiration. The most important thing for all those who laid out the game was whether their layout was effective or not. Effective was the most important thing. From the standpoint of one's own side, any calculation that could push the enemy into a situation where they had no choice was effective. The east block of Reki City was covered by artillery fire. From Li Tianlan's standpoint, this was the most effective way to deal with Jiang Qiansong. Everything came so quickly and violently. The violent artillery fire destroyed everything visible to the naked eye in just a few seconds. Buildings collapsed, street lamps shattered, the ground cracked, cars exploded and dust flew. In the world-destroying artillery fire, Fireman and the two sword masters were retreating. Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost were also breaking through. There was no time to think about it. The raging firepower released destructive power without stopping. Countless Reki City's military and police roared and rushed over. After the artillery fire, the sky was full of frost, flames, and even thunderbolts, destroying all people and things indiscriminately. Wulan State could not be regarded as a first-class country in the world. But this did not mean that the country was a soft persimmon. When the country entered a state of war, and more than half of the artillery fire in the capital city began to fall on a block, the destructive power of the overwhelming modern weapons was no less than that of any invincible realm expert with all his strength. The domain of the 30-meter mortal world continued to shrink, and finally shrank to a distance of tens of meters around Jiang Qiansong. The thick domain wrapped him and Black Ghost. However, The sky full of cannon fire still bombarded his domain from time to time. The domain was on the verge of collapse, and the light within it was also flickering. The whole battlefield had lost any effective sound. There were explosions everywhere, the sound of artillery fire pouring, and the roar of the military and police. Jiang Qiansong's brows furrowed tightly. He had no idea that Wulan State would be stimulated to this extent at this time. He wanted to explain that it was a misunderstanding. He was a good friend of the Rekvia family, and an ally of Wulan State. But under such a situation, he had no chance to speak at all. Why was this happening? He thought of the interrogations he had gone through on the way here. Jiang Qiansong finally realized that something was wrong. Jiang Qianyan's death did make Jiang Qiansong angry, and he even wanted to vent his anger on the Rekvia family, so he did not contact Shankar Rekvia after arriving in Reki City. In the absence of any contact between the two parties, he had always felt that the interrogation was normal. But only now did he truly realize what was wrong. The Rekvia family was crazy, and it was impossible to aim the artillery at himself because of his indifference. In Wulan State, the Rekvia family was supreme. At this time, the artillery fire of Wulan State listed him, and the people of the Snowdance Corps as targets at the same time. Was there a problem with the Rekvia family's control of Wulan State? Or is there a problem within the Rekvia family? Jiang Qiansong's heart sank. He suddenly thought of many bad possibilities. Endless artillery fire was still pouring down like a rain of destruction. Before he could fully understand those possibilities in his mind, the cruel reality had already appeared in front of him. Jiang Qiansong had no choice. He could either kill his way out, or he could be blown to death here. The domain of the 30-meter mortal world shrank slightly again. Then the infinite light suddenly spread out. The domain kept expanding, and the light expanded to hundreds of meters in an instant. In the light within hundreds of meters, it was a void of darkness and silence. The cannonball stagnated in the void. The bullet lost its power and floated in the void. The roaring military and police suddenly lost their voices. Their bodies floated up, completely lost gravity, and struggled in horror. Jiang Qiansong's eyes were angry and indifferent. He really didn't want to kill the soldiers of Wulan State here. But in contrast, he wanted to live more. Jiang Qiansong took a step forward. Black Ghost followed him closely. The two stepped out of the domain in an instant. Before the new domain appeared, the solidified bullets and cannonballs in the old domain suddenly exploded and turned into fire all over the sky. The violent fire completely swallowed up the military and police who had not yet landed. Blood and limbs sprayed out at the same time. Jiang Qiansong gritted his teeth. There was no sign of fireman and others in his sight. And now he still didn't know what the state of the Rekvia family was. He suddenly felt a little regretful. If he had contacted Shankar at the first time, everything might not be like this now. Jiang Qiansong continued to move forward. Countless blood and corpses fell to the ground, and pairs of eyes stared at Jiang Qiansong, recording his sins in Wulan State. Jiang Qiansong kept walking, and said in a cold and heavy tone, "Kill your way out. Go to the Rekvia headquarters." The Rekvia headquarters was located in the northeast of Wulan State. It was a huge castle built on a low mountain peak. The castle was called Rekvia Castle. Since the Rekvia family appeared in Eastern Europe, the castle had been renovated and expanded several times in hundreds of years. Now it had become one of the largest and most luxurious castles in Eastern Europe, and it was also jokingly called one of the safest places in Eastern Europe. This was Jiang Qiansong's goal. At this time, it was also the destination of Shankar's escape. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it was the 9th hour since Li Tianlan personally set off the storm in Reki City. Shankar, who fled all the way, finally approached the Rekvia castle. A day ago, Shankar, who was still high-spirited as if everything was under his control, was now pale. He approached the headquarters of the Rekvia family that was proud of. Instead of being excited, his whole person showed a taste of losing his soul. A few hours of hunting was the biggest nightmare of his life. He was running. Li Tianlan was chasing. In just a few hours, Shankar transferred nearly 80% of the experts of the Rekvia family from the castle to chase and intercept Li Tianlan. Shankar himself could not evaluate whether his actions were useful or not. In the past, the experts and elites in the castle rushed out of the castle in batches, and then died in front of Li Tianlan one by one. The distance between the two sides of the chase and escape had never been shortened, but it had never been further. After crossing most of the east side of the city, Shankar finally approached his destination. But the young highness behind him was still behind him. Neither fast nor slow. He had always been neither fast nor slow. Rekvia's castle was built on the mountain peak. Shankar stood at the foot of the mountain. On the road behind him was Li Tianlan, who was slowly moving forward. The castle, Shankar, Li Tianlan. The three of them seemed to be connected in a line. Shankar stood in the middle, with his headquarters and the enemy in front and behind him. Standing in this position, he suddenly couldn't tell whether he was closer to the castle or to Li Tianlan. The castle was silent and solemn on the mountain peak, but it looked a little desolate. It was impossible for the Rekvia family not to know that he was standing at the foot of the mountain at this time. But no one came out to meet him. Shankar suddenly felt a little desperate and sad. All this seemed to show that there were no experts in the family who could meet him. After the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, the Rekvia family, one of the pillars of the Polar Ground Alliance, was completely defeated by the youngest highness in the Dark World in just a few hours. Shankar didn't even dare to move forward. A family headquarters without enough experts seemed to have too little power to check and balance Li Tianlan. He stood in place with some stupefaction, looking at the castle and Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan came over step by step, seemingly calm and peaceful, but the killing intent condensed to the extreme on his body became sharper and sharper. There were no bodyguards around Shankar. The last bodyguard fell on the road 500 meters away. Now he was the only one facing Li Tianlan. His body trembled a little, but he tried to stand. "Don't run." Li Tianlan came to Shankar and asked without any emotion, "What do you want?" Shankar swallowed hard and said in a hoarse voice, "Don't forget your current situation. If you kill me, I can guarantee that the Rekvia family and Wulan state." "You can't guarantee anything," Li Tianlan said calmly. Now standing at the foot of the Rekvia castle, and hearing the news from cool breeze and drifting cloud, he finally felt relieved. "Before I came to Eastern Europe, the Rekvia family was yours, and so was Wulan state," Li Tianlan said. "After I came to Eastern Europe, now I stand in front of you. Do you think those powers still have anything to do with you?" "You?" Shankar stared at Li Tianlan fiercely. "What do you mean?" "What do I mean?" Li Tianlan murmured to himself, then nodded. "You should see it." He laughed, reached out and grabbed Shankar's collar directly, dragged him to the ground, and walked toward the castle. "You should see my Rekvia. It's good for young people to be ambitious." At the foot of the mountain where the rain fell, a voice suddenly appeared around Li Tianlan without warning. "But Rekvia is one of the 4 major families in Eastern Europe. With your current strength, even if the Rekvia family is given to you, can you afford it?" This voice was calm and stable, but it carried a kind of extremely suppressed killing intent. It was perfect Chinese. Shankar, who had been discouraged, suddenly ignited infinite hope when he heard this voice. He recognized this voice. So he struggled wildly in Li Tianlan's hands. "Mr. Jiang, help me." "Mr. Jiang." Li Tianlan's pupils suddenly contracted. In an instant, the malice and killing intent of the whole world seemed to suddenly envelop him. In the gloomy and stormy sky, the faint light completely disappeared. A patch of darkness swiftly enveloped all of his senses. Saber. The black saber light spread silently from behind Li Tianlan, with a near-perfect combination of speed and strength. An ordinary-looking middle-aged man in his 50s appeared in front of Li Tianlan. A black ghost took the initiative to launch a sneak attack from behind Li Tianlan. The black saber light rolled over, and it was as violent as a dark sea. The saber light sealed Li Tianlan's back and sides with absolute sharp killing intent. Li Tianlan's only direction could only go forward. In front of him was Jiang Qiansong. Li Tianlan grabbed Shankar in his hand, and his figure flickered and came directly to Jiang Qiansong. Jiang Qiansong's calm face stretched slightly, and for the first time, he showed a sincere smile. The 30-meter mortal world condensed to the extreme appeared around him. the confinement domain, known as the strongest in the dark world, directly shrouded Li Tianlan. Chapter 426. A delicate but incomparably heavy domain directly enveloped Li Tianlan. Jiang Qiansong's smile became even more obvious. This was the strongest forbidden move in the 30-meter mortal world. Not to mention that Li Tianlan had not broken through the invincible realm. Even if he really entered the invincible realm, it would be impossible for him to break this domain in a short time before he stabilized his realm. Everything seemed easy, but at the same time, it was not. Facing a young expert with the combat capability of the invincible realm, a top expert of the half-step invincible realm, the two invincible realm experts actually launched a sneak attack. This was indeed ungentlemanly. But as long as he succeeded, as long as it was effective, what did it matter if he was ungentlemanly? He had lost his demeanor today, but getting Li Tianlan was tantamount to getting the Samsara Palace. He even had the possibility to enter Zhongzhou State. The Jiang family of South America had 3 invincible realm experts. Before the tribulation, the only invincible realm killer in the dark world, Jiang Qianxia, died in Li Tianlan's hands. Jiang Qinyan, the second master of the Jiang family of South America, known as the Black Hand, also died in Li Tianlan's hands. Right now Li Tianlan would die in Jiang Qiansong's hands. How perfect was this karma? Haha. Jiang Qiansong finally laughed out loud. His laughter was vicious and cold. However, just as his laughter rang out, it suddenly froze on the spot. In his sight, Li Tianlan, who was trapped in the domain, raised his hands. With his current strength, he really couldn't break this cage. But just because he couldn't break it didn't mean that other things couldn't. Li Tianlan's hand lit up with silver light. The silver light instantly became incomparably dazzling. The silver bracelet on Li Tianlan's wrist began to stretch and elongate. In the blink of an eye, a silver sniper rifle more than 2 meters long appeared in Li Tianlan's hand. The silver sniper was ostentatious and domineering, but the patterns on the body of the gun appeared elegant and ruthless. Li Tianlan held the silver sniper in his hand, and his momentum soared to the sky in an instant. He raised the muzzle and aimed it at Jiang Qiansong, who was outside the domain. Jiang Qiansong's expression changed drastically. This silver spear was so familiar to him, yet so strange. This was a murderous weapon belonging to the Jiang family of South America. This was the legend of Qin, yet not the legend of Qin. This spear is called Falling Stars. Li Tianlan smiled and raised the muzzle. I'll give it to Mr. Jiang today. Any murderous weapon in the dark world was enough to deter an invincible realm expert. Especially in the hands of a person with the combat capability of the invincible realm like Li Tianlan. It was a completely different concept from that of an ordinary thunder-shocking realm expert, or even an ordinary half-step invincible realm expert. Even though Jiang Qiansong was known for his defense, he did not dare to take a blow from a murderous weapon head-on. Therefore, the moment Falling Stars was raised, he no longer cared about maintaining his domain. He turned around and ran. The moment the domain loosened, boundless sword energy surged on Li Tianlan, directly shattering the domain that Jiang Qiansong gave up maintaining. Falling Star turned into a silver sword. Li Tianlan carried Shenker in one hand and the sword in the other, laughing wildly as he rushed out of the domain. His figure flickered and appeared in front of the castle gate in the shortest time possible. The Rekvia castle was quiet. No one looked at Shenker, who was in Li Tianlan's hand. No one cared about Li Tianlan. Jiang Qiansong turned back and caught up with them with a gloomy face. He looked at Li Tianlan and was silent for a long time. The moment Li Tianlan tore the domain with his sword intent, he realized that he had been fooled by this boy. Jiang Qinyan never denied his value. In particular, the Jiang family of South America now had a huge cause and effect with Li Tianlan. A blow from a murderous weapon was precious enough, but if Li Tianlan could kill him, or even seriously injure him in one blow, it was worth it. Li Tianlan finally chose to use sword intent to smash the cage of desperation. This could only mean one thing. That Falling Star was most likely a modified version of the legend of Qin. Right now it hadn't fully charged up yet, so it couldn't fire. But there was nothing to be angry about. A murderous weapon that could not fire was beside Li Tianlan. This was definitely a good thing for him. It was even the best thing. Black Ghost appeared beside Jiang Qiansong. A pitch-black knife and a pitch-black person. He stood there, and his whole person exuded a deep and obscure darkness and killing intent, like a shadow shrouded in darkness beside Jiang Qiansong. Darkness was Black Ghost's domain. The invincible realm expert who was piled up by the Jiang family of South America by the cruelest means was naturally the most special one. Black Ghost's domain had no control effect. It was just that in his domain, his speed and strength would be multiplied, and his defense would be infinitely weakened. Jiang Qiansong once tested Black Ghost's full blow. In the dark domain, Black Ghost's speed and strength broke out at the same time. Although it was not as good as the Wind and Thunder veins in terms of lethality, it was equivalent to slightly surpassing the Wind vein in terms of pure speed. This was enough to show how terrifying Black Ghost in the dark domain was. Jiang Qiansong's heart was completely settled. He reached out to Li Tianlan and pointed to the silver sword blade in Li Tianlan's hand. "Give it to me." His tone was flat. Because of self-confidence, because everything was under control, so it was flat. Li Tianlan's voice was equally stable and calm, almost the same as Jiang Qiansong's. "You want it?" He smiled and raised Falling Star in his hand. "Come and get it yourself." Jiang Qiansong frowned slightly and glanced at Shenker, who was held in Li Tianlan's hand. His eyes were meaningful. This was the castle of the Rekvia family. "You were the patriarch of the Rekvia family. I was your ally. You were in the hands of the enemy. Was there a need to say what to do?" Shenker didn't need Jiang Qiansong to say anything at all. Since he saw Jiang Qiansong, with endless hope igniting in his heart, he stopped struggling and roared at the top of his lungs. "Open the door. I'm Shenker, your patriarch. Everyone come out and kill Li Tianlan. Don't worry about me. Kill him. This is an order." Cough. He roared so hard that his face turned red, and he coughed violently. Li Tianlan ignored Shenker's yelling, and just looked at Jiang Qiansong mockingly. The silent castle of Rekvia also ignored Shenker's yelling. It was silent. Shenker said that he didn't need to worry about him. The Rekvia family really didn't care about him. What was going on? Shenker's mind went blank for a moment. Even though he was held in Li Tianlan's hand, the authority of the patriarch still made him furious. "Open the door. Bastard Marijeff, what are you doing?" Marijeff was the butler of the Rekvia family. At the peak of the Thundershocking realm, he stayed in the Rekvia family after retiring from the Polar Ground Alliance. It had been nearly 15 years since then, and he was Shenker's absolute confidant. Seeming to feel Shenker's rage, the deep gate of the castle slowly opened. Before Shenker had time to breathe a sigh of relief, a black object suddenly flew out of it and landed right in front of Shenker. Shenker opened his mouth and seemed to want to scold something, but when he saw the thing in front of him, he suddenly lost all his voice. In his line of sight was a human head. It was a human head that had died with endless anger, anxiety, and surprise. The head of Marijeff's butler. This, Shenker's brain went blank. He was sluggish for a while before he screamed, "Jessica! Where's Jessica? What's going on?" Jessica was his woman, equivalent to half the hostess of this castle. She was also a Thundershocking realm expert who retired from the Polar Ground Alliance. She had an enchanting figure that Shenker could play with for a few years without getting tired of, and she could also provide protection for him at critical moments. Whoosh, the object cut through the air. Jessica's beautiful and enchanting head flew over and landed in front of Shenker. Shenker seemed to have lost all his strength. His face was ashen, and he didn't speak for a long time. Li Tianlan loosened his hand and threw him to the ground. Shenker sat on the ground and looked at the head in front of him dully, like a statue without the slightest vitality. Jiang Qiansong's heart sank and kept sinking. It was not until this moment that he vaguely understood what Li Tianlan meant by, "my Rekvia." This sentence did not mean that Rekvia was about to be his. But when Shenker was still alive, Rekvia seemed to have changed owners. "Tostel." Shenker suddenly stood up. His voice was a little trembling, and he called the last name that could be counted on, "Tostel. I'm here, dear brother." Just when Shenker was about to despair, there was no more head flying out of the castle, But a voice that made him ecstatic and then extremely angry came. A tall, strong and majestic figure walked out of the gate of the castle. Behind him were two indistinct figures from the east. Sai City, Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud. Shankar's face changed and he stared at his biological brother. For a while he couldn't say a word. Do you like it? Tostel pointed to the two heads beside Shankar. This is my gift to you. Tostel, the defense general of Wulan State. Unlike the national defense of Zhongzhou State, the national defense of Wulan State was a department with real power. It could mobilize most of the army of Wulan State and had great power. Jiang Qiansong's heart was still sinking, but there was a touch of understanding in his eyes. When the Reki City army indiscriminately covered the entire military region with firepower, he vaguely guessed that Zhongzhou State or Samsara Palace had raised a big fish in Wulan State. But now it seemed that this big fish was not only raised in Wulan State, but also in the Rekvia family. Li Tianlan looked at Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud. The two top assassins of Zhongzhou State nodded at the same time. Li Tianlan was relieved. He was chasing Shankar to control Jiang Qiansong's trajectory of activities, and at the same time, to attract the expert team from the headquarters of the Rekvia family. In order to rescue the patriarch, the experts of the Rekvia family rushed out of the castle in batches. With the constant emptiness of the headquarters of the castle, and Tostel acting as an insider, the two top assassins sneaked into the castle. With the cooperation of Tostel, they had now completely controlled the headquarters of the Rekvia family. On this trip to Eastern Europe, Li Tianlan had too many chips in his hands. Tostel was one of the most important chips, which belonged to the Samsara Palace. Tostel, do you know what you are doing? Did you turn to the Samsara Palace? You will become the sinner of the family. You will bring the Rekvia family to hell. You will. Enough. Tostel directly interrupted Shankar's last roar. I'm very sober. He looked at his brother and said calmly. But you don't seem to know what you are doing. The Polar Ground Alliance collapsed. If I don't take action this time, you will turn to the Jiang family of South America, and the entire Rekvia family will be annexed by the Jiang family of South America. As for me, I just cooperate with the Samsara Palace. Everyone knew that the headquarters of the Samsara Palace had been destroyed. They knew that the master of Samsara Palace died under the sword of Wang Tianzong. Under such circumstances, it was naturally safer to cooperate with the Samsara Palace than with the Jiang family of South America. Rekvia's cooperation partner did not necessarily have to be the Samsara Palace. Li Tianlan was their main goal. Behind Li Tianlan was Zhongzhou State and Samsara. The most important thing was that he was destined not to stay in Eastern Europe for a long time. If he wanted to occupy the interests of Eastern Europe, he could only find an ally. Tostel thought he was the best ally. Of course, the so-called fair cooperation also meant that both sides had the right to change their positions. Tostel said that what he wanted was the best result. But if there was an accident, such as they did this, but Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost killed Li Tianlan, Tostel would also give up Li Tianlan without hesitation and choose to turn to the Jiang family of South America. Before that, he needed to kill someone first. Tostel took out a pistol and aimed at Shankar, at his own brother. As long as Shankar died, no matter whether Li Tianlan and Jiang Qiansong won or lost, they could only choose to cooperate with him. He and Rekvia would be safe. Bang! A gunshot rang out. Shankar did not fall. An illusory sword intent rotated and shredded the bullet, bringing out a spark. Tostel suddenly turned his head and looked at Li Tianlan. Your Highness, Shankar must die. This is the condition of our cooperation. Of course. Li Tianlan laughed. But not now. Now he is still useful to be alive. Tostel's face was cloudy and uncertain. Mr. Tostel, Jiang Qiansong suddenly said, I'll help you kill Shankar. How about you and I join forces to kill Li Tianlan? Li Tianlan sneered and looked down at his watch without saying a word. Tostel noticed his movement and felt a little cold in his heart. He really wanted Shankar to die, but he was unwilling to give up the prospect of cooperation with Li Tianlan. If he chose the Jiang family of South America, Rekvia was destined to be annexed. Choosing Li Tianlan was tantamount to choosing Zhongzhou State. In this way, Rekvia would retain some full autonomy. And the most important thing was that Jiang Qiansong could not kill Shenker under Li Tianlan's eyes now. Even if Shenker died, he and the Jiang family of South America might not be able to kill Li Tianlan. Tostel shook his head. I'm sorry. He raised his hand. Under the gloomy sky, the silent castle suddenly lit up with a dazzling light. In the messy footsteps, groups of elites of the Rekvia family appeared in every corner of the castle, aiming at Jiang Qiansong and black ghosts with live ammunition. Li Tianlan's figure slowly rose into the air and landed at the top of the castle. On his left and right sides were cool breeze and drifting cloud. Below were countless elites of Rekvia. Jiang Qiansong's face became completely dignified. At this moment, Jiang Qiansong finally understood the seriousness of the matter. Li Tianlan caused great changes in Wulan state. Shenker, on the other hand, brought this upheaval to the international stage in a huge way. Now all the international pressure was in Reki City. Zhongzhou state was silent. Li Tianlan had no way back. But at this time, the Jiang family of South America also had no way back. The key was the attitude of the Rekvia family. If he killed Li Tianlan, no matter who was in charge of the Rekvia family, they would have to cooperate with the Jiang family of South America. If Li Tianlan killed Jiang Qiansong, he would also get the support of the Rekvia family. Rekvia, on the other hand, had the power to change the position of Wulan state. If this was a war, if Li Tianlan failed, the cooperation between the Jiang family of South America and Rekvia, with international pressure, even if they could not kill Li Tianlan, it was enough to make Li Tianlan have no foothold in the dark world, and the Li family would completely disappear. But if Jiang Qiansong failed, winner takes all. If Li Tianlan cooperated with the Rekvia family, the Jiang family of South America would stand in the position of the loser and bear all the international pressure and conquests after the great change in Wulan state. Wulan state had declared Zhongzhou state a hostile country, but after all, no real war broke out. As long as Rekvia changed its attitude, Wulan state could explain that this was a misunderstanding, restore its relationship with Zhongzhou state, and then list the Jiang family of South America as a target. It was unstable. This was the norm in the dark world. Jiang Qiansong stood in front of the castle and was silent for a long time. He was not sure what would happen if he rushed into the castle at this time and fought with Li Tianlan, the Snowdance Corps, and the Rekvia family. But he knew that if he turned around and left at this time, Li Tianlan would not even pay attention to him. He just wanted to kill Jiang Qianyan. He wanted to force the Jiang family of South America to withdraw from the feast in Eastern Europe, instead of fighting to the death with Jiang Qiansong. As long as Jiang Qiansong retreated without fighting, under the overwhelming international pressure, the Jiang family of South America would suffer absolutely heavy losses, not to mention gaining a foothold in Eastern Europe. Li Tianlan had now taken the initiative and controlled Rekvia. If Jiang Qiansong could not break the deadlock, he could only accept failure. So Li Tianlan now hoped that Jiang Qiansong could retreat. But Jiang Qiansong could never retreat. Jiang Qiansong stood quietly, looking at the mountains and the castle in front of him. The world seemed to shrink infinitely in front of him, turning into a long and narrow spider silk. Below the spider silk was a cliff. He stood on the spider silk, swaying, but he had to make a choice. This was where Li Tianlan had just stood. Li Tianlan walked over on the spider silk. Jiang Qiansong also had to move forward. Taking a step forward might not be heaven, but taking a step back would definitely be hell. Jiang Qiansong laughed. Ghosty. He snorted. Master. Black Ghost lowered his head. Follow me. Jiang Qiansong said and took a step forward. Boom. The entire castle shook violently. The surrounding mountains seemed to shake fiercely. The domain of the 30-meter mortal world began to extend in front of the castle. The black knife light filled the domain and became enough to tear everything apart. In the loud bang, the gate of the entire castle was completely shattered in a moment in the black knife light. Chapter 427. From the perspective of the distance between Im and Wulan state, the distance of hundreds of kilometers between the two countries was not far, but it was not easy to plan the route of the march. a distance of hundreds of kilometers, could not even leave a province in Zhongzhou state. But in Eastern Europe, where there were many small countries, from Im to Wulan state, they had to pass through two small countries with an area of about 20,000 square kilometers. Oga state, Ras state. No matter how they went, from Im to Wulan state, they had to pass through the borders of these two countries. Wulan state, Oga state and Ras state, plus Bayou state and Rosen state behind Wulan state. These were the 5 Eastern European countries that were very famous in the hearts of the military of Zhongzhou state. The reason why this area with 5 countries was so famous was that it was previously a place that the Arctic Ocean Command of Zhongzhou state could not reach at all. There were only 6 countries in Eastern Europe that did not have troops stationed in Zhongzhou state. The 5 countries occupied 5 of them. The other one was Snow Country, the largest country in the world. The mighty motorcade moved forward on the highway, all the way from the capital of Im. The rapid march without the slightest relaxation made the 5,000 elites of the Snowdance Corps move at the fastest speed. In the huge truck compartment that had been modified as a temporary headquarters, Major General Li Zhonghu, the commander of the 1st Division of the Snowdance Corps, looked at the electronic map on the screen expressionlessly, and his eyebrows were full of perseverance. After all, this full-speed march was different from the one more than 20 years ago. More than 20 years ago, the Arctic Ocean Command did not exist. The Highnesses of the Li family came to Eastern Europe with the initially established Border Control Corps. They fought their way out in a deadlock and hostility. That was how the Arctic Ocean Command came into being. Li Zhonghu was a veteran who had participated in that pioneering campaign. So when he thought of the grim situation and bloody fighting in those days, compared with the present, everything was like a repeat of the past. Li Zhonghu was in a trance. At that time, the 5 Eastern European countries with Wulan state as the core had also declared war on Zhongzhou state. At that time, the Li family, which supported the overall situation of Zhongzhou state, responded very simply. Fireman, the first vice-marshal of the Border Control Corps, led 600 elites to fight directly. In a day and a night, 600 elites directly penetrated the obstruction of Oga state and Ras state, flattened the defense of Wulan state, and headed straight for Reki City. In that turbulent era, Snow Country finally contacted many powerful countries in Western Europe, and several superpowers joined forces to force the Li family to retreat. The Li family withdrew from the 5 Eastern European countries, but the foundation of the Arctic Ocean Command was completely stabilized with the Li family's compromise. Time passed quietly for more than 20 years, until today. Li Tianlan arrived in Eastern Europe with the Snowdance Corps. The first order he gave the Snowdance Corps was to march into Reki City. The same family. There were 3 princes before and after him. Now, the youngest highness seemed to be doing what the 2 former highnesses of the Li family had failed to do. Li Zhonghu suddenly smiled. He was one of the first veterans of the Border Control Corps, and one of the elites who came to Eastern Europe with the 2 highnesses of the Li family. However, at that time he was still very young and his realm was low, far from being qualified to enter the Li family. Today, 20 years later, he was at his peak, and he followed the youngest highness of the Li family to Eastern Europe again, taking the same path that the Li family had taken. In this situation, Li Zhonghu's heart gradually became subtle and complicated. The truck's compartment was very large. The huge screen was playing the marching route of the Snowdance Corps at this time. The 5,000 elites were divided into 2 batches, with 3,000 people in the front and sprinting lightly. The 2,000 people in the back moved slower and carried heavy weapons. At this time, after a few hours of marching, the 2 groups of people had gradually pulled apart a distance that was not dangerous, but could no longer be regarded as absolutely safe. Li Zhonghu looked at the screen in front of him. All the high-level officials of this operation in the carriage also looked at the screen. The red line on the screen, which represented their marching route, passed through Im, Ras state, Oga state, and went directly to Reki City, the capital of Wulan state. Shockingly, it was an almost perfectly straight and extremely swift marching route. The Arctic Ocean Command fully cooperated. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the 5,000 elites of the Snowdance Corps left the border of Im. The request of the Snowdance Corps to borrow the road to march to Ras state was directly rejected. At 9:15 in the morning, the first batch of 3,000 elites of the Snowdance Corps set foot directly on the territory of Ross State. High-powered military trucks ran at full speed. At 11 o'clock in the afternoon, the Snowdance Corps, which had crossed the border of Ross State, passed by the capital of Ross State. At the closest time, the distance between the two sides was less than 50 kilometers. The Snowdance Corps went all the way north. Ross State, which had declared Zhongzhou State as a hostile country, had been silent about such a blatant and even aggressive march of Zhongzhou State. At 1:10 in the afternoon, the first 3,000 elites of the Snowdance Corps left the border of Ross State in silence. In the continuous rapid march, neither Ross State nor the Snowdance Corps let go of a single shot. They let the enemy's armed forces pass through. It was an absolute shame. But for the Snowdance Corps, it was a great honor. The morale of the 3,000 elites of the Snowdance Corps was rising. At 1:25 in the afternoon, the 3,000 elites entered the border of Oga State one after another. Oga State sent out the most elite reconnaissance corps to closely monitor the border. As soon as the Snowdance Corps entered the border of Oga State, the commander of the reconnaissance corps had already reported the situation to the high-level officials of Oga State, and then got an order. Pay close attention. The Snowdance Corps crossed the border of Oga State without hesitation, and went all the way deep. The reconnaissance corps kept retreating on the way of the Snowdance Corps. More and more troops of Oga State were coming, but they could only retreat without the order to start the war. The Snowdance Corps passed by Flying Snow City. Oga State, pay close attention. The Snowdance Corps passed by Bluewater State. Oga State, pay close attention. The Snowdance Corps passed by the rainforest area. Oga State, pay close attention. The Snowdance Corps approached the capital. The Snowdance Corps passed by the capital. Oga State, withdraw troops. The army of Oga State, which was full of impatience and resentment, followed the Snowdance Corps through half of the country without stopping. Finally, because of the order, they endured the conflict of cursing and watched the Snowdance Corps leave the capital of Oga State. Ross State was a disgrace. Oga State was also a disgrace. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the convoy of the vanguard of the Snowdance Corps added gasoline, confirmed the distance of the heavy armored troops behind, and continued to march. Li Zhonghu, who had been silent for a long time in the carriage, finally said, "Everyone, we will officially enter Wulan State in about half an hour. Who can tell me how long it will take us to get to Reki City?" In the carriage, the high-level officials of this operation were all silent for a while. They passed through Ross State and Oga State without any conflict. The morale of the 3,000 elites of the Snowdance Corps had reached its peak. But only the real high-level officials understood that this was not a good thing. The silence of Ross State and Oga State was not only a shame, but also a representation of their pragmatic style. They had declared war on Zhongzhou State and officially listed Zhongzhou State as a hostile country. They could not be so cowardly. But the two countries did not react at all, and let them cross the border. The biggest possibility was that they wanted to gather all their forces and fight to the death with the 5,000 people of the Snowdance Corps. They wanted to accomplish the task at one stroke, so the road ahead was doomed to not be peaceful. Ahead, they were very likely to meet the coalition forces of Ross State, Oga State and Wulan State. Although the other party mobilized the troops in a hurry, who could tell how many people there would be? They only had 5,000. The other party might have 10,000, 20,000, or even more from this position. It would take them more than 3 hours to leave the border of Oga State and reach Reki City at full speed with the speed of the truck. That was, under normal circumstances, they would arrive at Reki City at about 7 o'clock. But there was bound to be no normal situation ahead. When Li Zhonghu asked them when they could arrive at Reki City, he was undoubtedly asking everyone how long their war against the coalition forces of the three countries would last. Hasn't the information from the front come yet? Sun Mengran, the deputy commander of the 1st Division of the Snowdance Corps, asked. In the Border Control Corps, Sun Mengran's rank and position were the same as Li Zhonghu's. But at this time he became Li Zhonghu's main deputy. Of course, his military rank was still the same as Li Zhonghu's. I'm not sure. Li Zhonghu shook his head and said, "The other party is obviously prepared. Although it's a little hasty, there was news 10 minutes ago that there were traces of a large number of military personnel on the border of Wulan State. But at present, no military flags of Oga State and Ross State have been found. But according to the observation of our investigators, there are at least 12,000 troops on the border of Oga State. Li Zonghu paused and didn't go on. Sun Mingran had already understood the meaning of this sentence. Oga State and Wulan State had a very close relationship. It could be said that they had always advanced and retreated together. Oga State was definitely not the object of Wulan State's defense. On the border of the two countries, it was absolutely impossible for Wulan State to station more than 10,000 troops. 2,000 was already the limit. Now, in such a short time, the other party had gathered at least 12,000 troops. This could only be the coalition forces of the three countries. And 12,000 people was just a conservative estimate. It doesn't sound like a lot. Sun Mingran thought for a moment and said calmly, "General Li, what's your limit?" A voice suddenly sounded. A young man in his 30s stood up in the corner of the carriage. The young man's appearance was ordinary, and his tone was a little dull, so his expression was particularly serious when he asked. The young man obviously did not belong to the Snowdance Corps. Including the few people around him, they all had a completely different temperament from the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps. That temperament was not noble or reserved, but at first glance, they did not look like professional soldiers. The young man held a long silver spear in his hand, and his eyes were solemn. Li Zonghu glanced at him, subconsciously straightened up, and raised his arm to salute the young man slightly. The young man raised his hand to return the salute. Although he was young, the lieutenant general epaulet on his shoulder was genuine. It depends on the level of the other party's elites. Li Zonghu explained seriously, if it's the strongest elites of the three countries, 45,000 people will probably be our limit if we want to break through the defense of the other party and reach Reki City with 3,000 people, and still be able to maintain a certain combat capability. The strongest elites of the three countries. Li Zonghu's words were extremely arrogant. They only had 3,000 people against 45,000 people, which was equivalent to a battle-loss ratio of 1:15. Li Zonghu even asked these people to have a certain combat capability, which meant that the battle-loss ratio would be higher. What about ordinary people? The young lieutenant general asked. 60,000 people. Li Zonghu said. If we don't consider their weapons. The young man nodded. He thought for a moment and said, we can do it. Li Zonghu froze and subconsciously shifted his gaze. His gaze fell on a middle-aged man beside the young man. The middle-aged man sat silently in the corner, and didn't say a word from beginning to end. He just lowered his head and slowly wiped the ridiculously large bow in his hand. But no one dared to ignore his existence. This was the only general of the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State among all the people present. Seeing Li Zonghu's gaze, he nodded and said in a simple tone, "One arrow." "That's enough." Li Zonghu solemnly saluted. "Thank you, General." The middle-aged general nodded. Li Zonghu took a deep breath and said, "Since the two generals are willing to take action, then we expect. Not expected." A clear voice suddenly sounded, like the spray of water flowing through a barren desert, clear and cold. "It's a must. Uncle Li, we must arrive in Reki City before 8 o'clock. A young woman stood up beside the middle-aged general and the young lieutenant general. She had no makeup on, but she was extremely beautiful and pure. She wore a red dress that was out of place with the surroundings. Her white hand held an ancient sword with a scabbard full of cracks. Her eyes were firm and persistent. "Young madam is right." The young lieutenant general smiled and said, "We must arrive in Reki City before 8 o'clock." The young woman's face became ruddy, and she glanced at the lieutenant general with her clear eyes. There was a soft smile on the lieutenant general's dull face, and he gave her a thumbs up. "I'm willing to be the sharp knife of these 3,000 people, and walk in front." The woman whispered, "This should be helpful to Uncle Li." "No." Li Zonghu was shocked and said without hesitation, "First miss you." "No." He didn't know what to say but insisted, "Absolutely not. Father will agree." The woman whispered, This is the family style of the Dongqing clan. I know the marshal will agree, Li Zonghu said with a wry smile. But His Highness won't agree. I won't agree. Everyone here won't agree. But the woman frowned. One arrow is not enough. Then let's add another strike. A gentle and casual voice suddenly sounded. A young man who seemed to have no sense of existence stood up and said with a smile, "That's enough." Li Zonghu glanced at him and frowned. He didn't know this young man, but he followed the first miss into the car and said that he was a friend of His Highness, so he couldn't say anything. But at this time, everyone was staring at the young man who suddenly stood up. The young man smiled. He stretched and said with a smile, "What's wrong? Don't you believe me?" "I believe you." The middle-aged general, who had been silently wiping the giant bow in his hand, suddenly said. He raised his head and looked at the somewhat lazy young man, with undisguised fear and appreciation in his eyes. He didn't know this young man, but he could clearly feel the terrifying aura of the other party, which was like a surging river. And the other party was so young. The general could even be sure that in today's Zhongzhou state, after Wang Shengxiao and Jiang Shangyu's realm fell, even Gu Hanshan's realm was still there. But in the younger generation, except for Li Tianlan, the young man in front of him was definitely the strongest, and even the strongest. Li Tianlan was the heavenly son. He was the top young heavenly son. His arrow. His sword. Chapter 428. The mighty motorcade stopped less than 15 kilometers from the border of Wulan state. Oga Nation was mountainous. The border between Oga and Ulan was mostly an undulating mountain range with steep slopes. Even the most powerful truck could not pass through. Only the most advanced main battle tanks could barely pass through. The 3,000 elites at the front of the Snowdance Corps abandoned the heavy firepower corps. At the same time, it meant that everyone had to cross this mountain range on foot. Li Zonghu ordered to abandon the car. All the higher-ups walked out of the temporary command center. All the soldiers arranged their formations in silence, forming one line after another. In the wilderness, the silent and oppressive atmosphere was almost suffocating. Interweaving formation, arranging weapons, everything proceeded in silence. Li Zonghu, Sun Mengran, and several other senior officers of the Border Control Corps had long been accustomed to it. These were the direct troops who had been with them for several years, and they were already very familiar with each other. But in addition, a group of officers of the Special Warfare System of Zhongzhou State, who were originally in the plan but were arranged to meet by chance for various reasons, looked more and more solemn. This group of people was very small in the list of troops, adding up to less than 20 people, but the lineup was incomparably luxurious. Terracotta Army of Zhongzhou State. General of the Ninth Heaven, one of the four spirits of Zhongzhou State, held a longbow. His code name was Vermilion Bird. Li Wangsheng, Lieutenant General of 9 Regions, one of the four spirits of Zhongzhou State, held a silver spear and codenamed Black Tortoise. The two groups of terracotta soldiers had a total of 14 people. Dongqing Rushi, the daughter of the Dongqing clan and the genius disciple of Jade Pool, was holding an ancient sword and wearing a red dress. The eldest disciple of Jade Lake, Su Chu, was dressed in a military uniform and looked majestic. Finally, it was the young man who was going to attack together with General of the Nine Heavens Lin Yuxian, the former heir of the Lin clan, was a special figure who was not from Zhongzhou State but stood in Li Tianlan's camp. This was a powerful force that was now in the Snowdance Corps, but had no connection with the Snowdance Corps on the surface. Everyone watched the Snowdance Corps silently reorganize the army. Dongqing Rushi seemed to have seen this before. Her beautiful face was calm. But apart from her, everyone else's expression gradually changed. This is not the Border Control Corps. He suddenly spoke and broke the silence. The Snowdance Corps was a special warfare corps composed of 15,000 elites of the Border Control Corps. But the 3,000 people in front of him, it was definitely not the Border Control Corps. It was an indescribable feeling. Every elite troop had a soul and an unshakable spirit. Only troops with souls could be called elites. He had seen the elite troops of Zhongzhou State. The Border Control Corps was known as the most elite super-large comprehensive corps in Zhongzhou State. Their quality was naturally the best in Zhongzhou State. But even the strongest corps in Zhongzhou State could never reach this level. 5 minutes. The 3,000 soldiers stood in their formation in silence. The 3,000 elites in the truck, who had been quiet all this while, seemed to have completely erupted in an instant. Cold, iron-blooded, unswerving, silent, yet with an indescribable majesty and an extreme desire to attack. The morale of the entire army was rising. However, his aura, which was enough to make the world's battle prowess, was constantly being restrained, becoming calm and collected. As far as the eye could see, the 3,000 elites standing in a neat formation were like a pack of disciplined wolves. At the same time, it was like a wildfire that could engulf everything at any time. They couldn't be the elites of the Border Control Corps. He was almost sure that if there were nearly 600,000 such elites in the Border Control Corps. No, with only 100,000 such elites, Zhongzhou State could completely sweep away the turbulent Southeast Asia in the shortest time, and even sweep away all the troops of all countries in the world. To describe the 3,000 people in front of him as elites was simply an insult to them. Every elite troop had a military soul, and the 3,000 people standing here were the military soul. There were not many troops of this level, even in the heyday of the Li family, the Wang family of Beihai, or Zhongzhou State. He subconsciously held the longbow in his hand. The aura of the 3,000 people standing together had vaguely integrated into one, with a kind of power that even he was extremely afraid of. Among the 4 spirits of Zhongzhou State, except for Li Wangsheng, who was still inexperienced and was still at the peak of the thundershocking realm, the other 3 were the top superiors of the half-step invincible realm. As a general of 9th heaven, he had always been extremely confident in his strength. But at this time, facing such a military soul, he felt that he couldn't resist it even if only 1,000 people were needed, not 3,000. This is definitely not the Border Control Corps. His voice was hoarse and he slowly repeated, "This is the Border Control Corps." Li Zonghu smiled. His smile was restrained and wild, but there was a kind of excitement in his eyes that couldn't be concealed. The strongest corps in Zhongzhou State? Li Wangxing murmured to himself thoughtfully. Lin Yuxian didn't speak, just watching all this in silence. The strength of these 3,000 elites was not very strong, but the aura made him vaguely see the shadow of Xianyuan's sword, the strongest troop of the Lin clan. Of course, in terms of strength, they might not be comparable to Xianyuan's sword, but there were only 300 Xianyuan sword troops. But there were already 3,000 of them here in front of him. What did this mean? There was a sudden flash of light in the distant sky. The light rose all the way, crossed the top of the mountain, and radiated brilliance in the sky. There was an orange brilliance. Li Zonghu frowned slightly and narrowed his eyes. This was the signal released by the scouts ahead. The situation needed to release the signal, which meant that the scouts had encountered danger, and were even surrounded. The orange signal meant difficulty, which meant that the number of enemies exceeded at least 30,000 people. The signal flashed high in the sky. The 3,000 elites raised their heads at the same time, and looked at the signal in the sky. This was a troop without any heavy firepower configuration. They gave up firepower and got the fastest speed. The signal flashed in front of the troops without heavy firepower configuration. In the square formation of 3,000 people, the iron-blooded and cold momentum was rising. Li Zonghu walked to the front of the team, stretched out his hand, and pointed to the mountains ahead. His voice was very light, but it echoed in the audience with incomparable tranquility and dominance. "Step over it." After stepping over the mountain in front of them, it was their battlefield. The battlefield of soldiers. 3,000 people moved forward at the same time. In the orderly footsteps that made people's faces change, the 3,000 people walked lightly and rushed straight to the hillside ahead. The whole formation suddenly seemed to break up, but the connection between them became more and more subtle. They were like countless individuals, like a whole that cooperated with each other, and like a complete army. Full speed charge. Lin Yuxian opened his mouth wide. He looked helplessly at Li Zonghu leading people all the way forward and didn't know what to say. Didn't he open the way with a sword? What kind of operation was this? He seemed to be a little helpless and lost in thought. Every time there is a war in the Border Control Corps, the officers are in front, and the soldiers are behind. Even if they retreat, the soldiers retreat first, and the officers stay behind. Dongqing Rushi said softly, "They may need your sword and arrow, but it will always be the officers of the Border Control Corps who rush to the front. This is the military rule of the Border Control Corps. Those who violate it will be killed." There have been countless sacrifices in the Border Control Corps over the past 20 years, but no officer has ever violated this military rule. Dongqing Rushi's voice was ethereal and agitated. Not one. Lin Yuxian took a deep breath and suddenly turned around. In the footsteps that covered the mountains and resounded through the world, the blood seemed to burn silently and began to boil. Dongqing Rushi rushed forward. Lin Yuxian and Su Chu followed closely. 9 Heavens General, 9 Provinces Lieutenant General, 2 groups of terracotta soldiers moved forward at the same time. They stepped over the mountains. They set foot on the top of the mountain. The boundary monument of Oga State became extremely small. A dense army appeared in his line of sight. The army of Ra State. The army of Oga State. The army of Wulan State. Countless heavy weapons were urgently set up on the national border of Wulan State. A large number of troops looked at each other across the huge gullies between the mountains. If they wanted to break through the blockade of the enemy coalition from here, they had to go down the mountain first, and then charge toward the mountain that belonged to Wulan State. From the bottom up. In terms of terrain, the Snowdance Corps was at an absolute disadvantage. 3,000 people began to slowly descend the mountain. From the top of the mountain to the foot, the coalition forces stood on the mountain. The Snowdance Corps watched from the foot of the mountain. From the perspective of looking up, the coalition forces of the 3 countries were dense, like a dark cloud that covered the sky, which was daunting. Go back, people of Zhongzhou State. Oga State and Wulan State are not places you should come to. A loud and clear voice rumbled down from the top of the mountain with an imposing aura. Go back. Go back. Go back. Go back. Go back. The coalition forces of at least 30,000 people on the mountain roared at the same time, and their momentum shook the world. Li Zonghu stood at the forefront. Beside him was Major General Sun Mengran, the deputy division commander. Li Zonghu pursed his lips slightly and looked up. On the top of the mountain in his sight, a general of Wulan State looked down at Li Zonghu. The evening sun gradually set. The light shrouded the mountains. In the faint sunlight, Li Zonghu chuckled. The gale in the mountains was whistling up and down. All the eyes of the coalition forces of the 3 countries fell on Li Zonghu. At that moment, the mountain, the grass, the setting sun, and the ominous blades all gathered on Li Zonghu. The mighty orange setting sun glowed. The line rushed over from behind him with the momentum of devouring heaven and earth, and then merged with him. Li Zonghu stretched out his hand and shook it. A very thick metal pipe fell from his cuff. The metal pipe stretched in his hand, grew longer and longer, and finally became a long pole nearly 10 meters high. Li Zonghu held the long pole and threw it violently. In an instant, a scarlet flag stretched out from the top of the long pole. The wind howled. The flag suddenly fluttered in the wind. There were only 2 scarlet flags. One was the golden star flag of Zhongzhou State. On the other side, there was only 1 star on the scarlet flag. That was the private medal of Dongqing Wudi, the executive minister of the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State, the god of massacre of Zhongzhou State, and the former commander of the Border Control Corps. Li Zonghu held the flagpole tightly and said calmly, "The marshal is watching us." In the ravine of the valley, the 3,000 elites suddenly became quiet, and even their breathing seemed to gradually disappear. Only Li Zonghu's voice stirred the sky. "His Highness is also watching us." The endless murderous intent that was enough to tear the sky spread among the 3,000 troops, blotting out the sky and covering the earth. The sun gradually set. "From now on," Li Zonghu said slowly, "we are the 1st Division of the Snowdance Corps, code name." His voice resounded in everyone's ears from afar, like a solemn oath. "Thunderbolt." In the back froze for a moment. Everyone froze for a moment. The most elite army in Zhongzhou State was the Border Control Corps. The most elite army in the Border Control Corps was the Thunderbolt Battalion, which was directly under Dongqing Wudi. However, everyone knew that the Thunderbolt Battalion had been traded to the Wang family of Beihai by the Dongqing clan. Now the 1st Division of the Snowdance Corps was codenamed Thunderbolt. What did that mean? It only meant one fact. The deal with the Wang family of Beihai was not complete. At least part of the Thunderbolt Battalion was still in the hands of the Dongqing clan. Now it was in Li Tianlan's hands. On the top of the mountain, the bodies of the coalition forces of the three countries began to tense up. In the increasingly silent world, Li Zonghu's voice sounded uninterrupted. Zhongzhou State is also watching us. He raised the flagpole in his hand, pointed straight ahead and said calmly, "Rush over with me." The voice was so calm. But the response that followed was completely earth-shattering. In the roar that went straight into the sky, the soldiers gathered like a rushing stream. Rush over. Rush over. Rush, 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 rush. In the cold mountain wind, the scarlet flag engraved with stars suddenly fluttered wildly at the forefront. Without any hesitation, the 3,000 people charged at full speed, completely ignoring everything. Charge up. Charge. The sound of gunfire sounded on the mountain, and the strong fire directly rushed down with the smell of gunpowder. The ice wall, wind, frost, flames, and thunder shone at the foot of the mountain, and then it was shattered by the gunfire. Countless shells exploded in the crowd. The 3,000 people completely ignored it. A large number of their companions fell in front of them and at their feet. The 3,000 elites of the Thunderbolt Battalion ignored it and faced the gunfire all over the sky. They stepped on the bodies of their companions. Rush up. Rush over. Everyone was carrying out Li Zonghu's simplest and calmest order. No matter what they encountered, they were rushing up. Without hesitation, at all costs. Rush. The bodies of their comrades were trampled into flesh and blood. In the valley where blood and fire were flying at the same time, the soaring killing intent filled the air. Everyone's eyes were completely red. The marshal was watching them. His Highness was watching them. Zhongzhou State was watching them. The whole world was watching them. Rush up, rush over. No hesitation, no cowardice, no retreat, no looking back. Don't retreat, even if it's warm. Don't look back, even if you miss it very much. On the indomitable road, in addition to the bodies of the losers, there were also the songs of the winners. We die a worthy death. This was the motto of the entire Dongqing clan. It was also the motto of the entire Border Control Corps. Rush up. Rush up. The bodies kept falling and being trampled into mud. The process from the foot of the mountain to the top was extremely long and short. The 3,000 Thunderbolt Battalion stepped on the road built by blood and corpses, and rushed to the top of the mountain with unparalleled madness and unruliness. The moment the 3,000 people and the 30,000 people came into contact, the allied forces of the three countries began to collapse at the first time, and the formation suddenly became loose. Rush up. Rush over. This was the Thunderbolt Battalion. The strongest Thunderbolt Battalion. In the hundreds of years since the founding of Zhongzhou State, there had never been such a proud army. This was the most unyielding army in Zhongzhou State. The leader was invincible. Invincible. Chapter 429. Invincible in the world? Invincible? Invincible? There was no word to describe the momentum of the Snowdance Corps' charge. The fire burst on the mountainside, and dense bullets poured out like a rainstorm. In the coalition forces of the three states, everyone, whether in the fire-flaming realm or the thunder-shocking realm, attacked without reservation. The attacks all over the sky turned into dazzling light and shadow. The 3,000 people were constantly decreasing, but the speed of the charge was getting faster and faster, like a wildfire wantonly invading on the front line, like a crazy tide rushing in the deep sea. The attack was like fire. The momentum was like thunder. The skybreaker. This was not like a troop at all. It was like a knife, a sword, full of killing intent. Pure. Overall. When Li Zonghu, who had been rushing in front of the 3,000 people, stepped on the top of the mountain, and the scarlet star flag flew in his hand, The coalition forces of the three states standing in front of the phalanx began to retreat almost instinctively, 30,000 against 3,000. But the whole situation was completely reversed in an instant. It was impossible to describe the situation on the top of the mountain as a rout. The most vivid description should be collapse. The most complete collapse. The coalition forces, which were so dense that they could not see the edge at a glance, began to loosen the moment they came into contact with the Snowdance Corps. The sound of artillery and firearms seemed to stagnate for a moment. Boundless lightning and raging fire flew out from every corner of the battlefield, covering the whole battlefield. After the ice condensed, it exploded in all directions. The setting sun was like blood. Blood flowed like a river. On the top of the mountain at the junction of Oga State and Wulan State, a large scarlet and dazzling wave of blood suddenly rose. Corpses, limbs, skulls, and broken weapons condensed together. In the scene like Shura hell, the setting sun gradually shone in the sky, which seemed to be endless lightning. Frost and flames flew at the same time in the storm of surging power, with blood and death, turning into a cold but fanatical war picture. In less than 5 minutes, the coalition forces of 30,000 people were directly torn apart by the Snowdance Corps from the front. They were like wolves and demons. But in the end, this was an army, the most elite combat corps that was completely dedicated to killing and fighting. The 3,000 people gathered together was like a huge meat grinder. The meat grinder moved forward slowly, harvesting the lives of the coalition forces like harvesting crops. 10 minutes. The Allied forces were completely routed. The last afterglow of the sun shone on the hillside, and the entire mountaintop had turned completely blood-red. In everyone's sight, the scarlet-red star flag of Zhongzhou State was still fluttering, unusually frivolous. In the sight that had begun to shake, the faces of the soldiers of the 3 Eastern European countries were distorted. Some people threw away their guns and ran for their lives. Some of them cried out in pain with pale faces. Some of them knelt down subconsciously and raised their hands. At the same time, there were also people who seemed to have lost their minds and started shooting crazily. In the end, they even rushed forward. His body swayed slightly. The initial pain had already passed, and he was gradually becoming numb. He could no longer condense the raging fire in his hand. Chest, abdomen, shoulder, more than 10 bullets embedded in his body were becoming colder and colder. His body temperature dropped. With his last breath, he reached out and grabbed the epaulet on his shoulder. He took off the epaulet representing the rank of colonel in Zhongzhou State with trembling hands, and handed it to his most trusted subordinate. The endless darkness in front of him seemed to be gradually eroding him, and the countless voices in his ears began to become chaotic. Leader! Leader! Old Zhang! You are not allowed to go over. Follow the rules of the battlefield. To the leader! Countless chaotic voices seemed to ring in his ears, and then gradually faded away, getting farther and farther away from him. The Border Control Corps had the strictest battlefield discipline and detailed rules. The whole corps was based on the army. The 5 armies were based on the division. The division was based on the regimental headquarters. Going down layer by layer, it could be specific to the unit at the squad level. On the battlefield, no matter what combat establishment, when one's immediate superior died in battle, one was not allowed to collect the corpse. He was only allowed to carry the epaulet and average of the deceased. After the death of an officer, all subordinates must immediately be assigned to the establishment of the combat organization of the same level to continue fighting. No hesitation. No hesitation. This was the battlefield of the Border Control Corps. This was the war of the Border Control Corps. There were only 2 words for the Border Control Corps on the battlefield: fight or sacrifice. The living would continue to fight. The sacrifice would spread their flesh and blood on the battlefield. Only the epaulet would eventually return to the homeland. The epaulet left his palm. The colonel's vision became completely blurred. When the darkness surrounded him, he remembered the golden epaulet he had just worn on his shoulder, his wife and daughter at home, and Zhongzhou State. The darkness grew darker and darker, but everything on the battlefield suddenly became clear. The colonel burst out laughing. An incomparably intense flame suddenly ignited on his body. He closed his eyes, and his body was completely tense. In the horrified gaze of the coalition forces of the three countries, his body flew over like a cannonball. The power turned into a raging flame. Then it was the cruelest coverage. There was no sound of explosion, but a raging fire with the afterglow of life suddenly exploded. In countless desperate screams, it swallowed everything. The Border Control Corps was still moving forward, and no one even looked at it. The Border Control Corps was still moving forward, and no one even looked at it. From beginning to end, they had only one order: charge. The star flag in front of them was still fluttering. The former Thunderbolt Battalion of the Border Control Corps, and now the Thunderbolt Division of the Snowdance Corps, had no territory or land in their world, only the star flag. Where the star flag was fluttering, there would be no soldiers of the Thunderbolt Battalion, and there would be corpses of the Thunderbolt Battalion. The strongest elite corps of Zhongzhou State fell one after another, and the coalition forces of the three countries began to fall in batches. The 30,000 people seemed to have surrounded 3,000 people, but the whole scene looked like 30,000 people were completely crushed by 3,000 people. The whole battlefield became fragmented with the charge of the Snowdance Corps. In the center of the army formation, as the Snowdance Corps advanced, the torn army formation became more and more scattered. At the forefront of the Snowdance Corps, the fluttering star flag was about to completely break through the blockade of the 30,000 coalition forces. For the coalition forces, this was definitely an undignified defeat. But seeing that the Snowdance Corps had rushed over, everyone felt relieved. In front of the real army soul, everyone seemed to realize a fact. Dignity was far less important than living. The Snowdance Corps was about to break out of the coalition forces' blockade. All of a sudden, the star flag at the forefront suddenly stopped. Turn around. In an instant, the star flag, which was getting farther and farther away, began to get closer and closer. Li Zonghu did not completely rush out of the army formation. Instead, when he approached the back of the army formation, he did not hesitate to turn around and rush back in another direction. The morale of the entire Snowdance Corps rose to the limit in an instant. Charge. Countercharge. The army formation, which had become extremely scattered, was instantly penetrated again. The coalition forces of the three Eastern European countries began to flee in panic. The first batch of deserters began to appear on the battlefield. There were more and more deserters. It was almost the time when the situation was hopeless. At the rear of the coalition forces, in the headquarters that Li Zonghu had never reached, a dazzling flash of lightning suddenly covered 100 meters away. The experts of Wulan State, who had always been hiding in the army formation, finally took action. They were originally the force that laid the foundation of the overall situation. The high-level officials of the three countries all hoped to use ordinary troops to consume the strength of the Snowdance Corps, and finally let the experts decide the victory. But now the strength of the Snowdance Corps had not been consumed too much, and the experts guarding the border could not sit still at all. 100 meters away, the dazzling and condensed lightning spread rapidly in the air, and went straight to the star flag at the forefront of the Snowdance Corps. The one who took action was a lieutenant general of the military of Wulan State. As an expert who was infinitely close to the half-step invincible realm, he could be sure that Li Zonghu was no match for him. Now that he had been preparing a full blow for a long time, it was almost no less than that of an ordinary half-step invincible realm expert. As long as he killed Li Zonghu with this blow, it would definitely be a huge setback for the Snowdance Corps. The lightning spread like a dragon. The figure of the Lieutenant General of Wulan State rushed up to the sky and arrived with the lightning. He clenched his fists slightly. The huge force, which was almost no less than the full blow of a half-step invincible realm expert, was surging and was about to completely cover Li Zonghu. The world suddenly became extremely quiet for a moment. The chaotic noise on the battlefield seemed to have suddenly gone away. The last light of the setting sun remained tenaciously in the sky. But in an instant, the whole sky seemed to become extremely dark. The pitch-black sky was faintly glowing, and the faint crackling sound suppressed the slaughter on the battlefield. The air gradually became messy under the dark sky. Hundreds of meters away, under the dark sky, General E of the 9th Heaven of Zhongzhou State pulled the exaggeratedly huge bow in his hand. He bent the bow like a full moon. The bowstring was pulled to the limit in an instant. A flash of lightning appeared in Yi's hand. The lightning gathered into an arrow. The Lieutenant General of Wulan State, who was close to the half-step invincible realm, was less than 20 meters away from Li Zhonghu. But under the pitch-black sky, these 20 meters looked like 20 li keel run. Run. A hoarse voice suddenly rang out behind the Lieutenant General. A burst of extremely condensed killing intent locked on the Lieutenant General in an instant. The Lieutenant General subconsciously looked up at the sky. The sky changed slightly for a moment, and there was a touch of strange blue in the darkness. The Lieutenant General's pupils suddenly contracted. This was not the night. The pitch-black darkness that enveloped the sky was astonishingly the extremely dense lightning. The absolute blue continued to gather, and eventually turned into dead darkness. The Lieutenant General struggled to turn his body. Whoosh! The sound of an arrow leaving the string suddenly passed through the entire battlefield. A dark blue arrow was already in front of the Lieutenant General the moment the sound rang out. Wherever the blue arrow passed, the dark sky completely collapsed, and the thunderbolts fell like a rainstorm, destroying everything. This arrow was shot at the Lieutenant General of Wulan State. But wherever the arrow passed, all the coalition forces of Wulan State were instantly turned into powder. There was no time to dodge. The blue arrow was like a blue light. As soon as the Lieutenant General moved for a moment, the arrow had shot directly into his chest. Boom! It was as if a bomb had exploded on the battlefield. The blue arrow passed through hundreds of meters of bow and arrow, smashed all the defenses of the Lieutenant General, and shot him directly into the air. The huge force obliterated his body and raged wildly around him. Wherever the blue light passed, no matter if it was an expert or a soldier, they were all crushed into pieces. The whole battlefield became extremely silent for a moment. The coalition forces of the three countries were slaughtered by the Snowdance Corps. None of the masters hiding in the back dared to make a move. That could be said to be an earth-shattering arrow. It represented too many things. Everyone thought of a legendary general in Zhongzhou State. There seemed to be only one master who used a bow in Zhongzhou State. Vermilion Bird, one of the four spirits. General of the ninth heaven, and the one in his hand was like a nightmare to the enemy. Is this the string of rainstorm? Lin Yuxian looked at the huge bow and arrow in Yi's hand, and his eyes were a little fiery. The string of rainstorm was one of the legendary four spirits' armors. It was as famous as the Azure Dragon armor of Gongsun Qi, the Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou State, the Curtain of Night. The Curtain of Night was attached with the world's top optical camouflage ability. The biggest feature of the string of rainstorm was its deformation and energy aggregation. To some extent, this bow already had the prototype of a thermal weapon. He did not speak. His palms slightly relaxed for a moment, and the huge bow and arrow in his hand began to twist. Finally, it wrapped around his arm and spread all the way. It turned into a close-fitting suit of changing colors and clung tightly to him. It's your turn. After he shot the arrow, he looked at Lin Yuxian and said calmly, Black Tortoise will follow you with 2 groups of terracotta army. He reached out and pointed forward. On the hillside, the Snowdance Corps was still rushing and killing. He pointed to another direction that was chaotic but temporarily could not be affected by the Snowdance Corps. I choose there. Lin Yuxian shook his head and pointed to the left side of the coalition forces of the 3 countries. The middle side will be handed over to the Snowdance Corps, the right side to the Terracotta Army, and the left side to me. Yourself? Yi and Li Wangsheng frowned at the same time. Enough. Lin Yuxian smiled. The soft sword was straightened in his hand. He moved forward slowly, and his aura began to change gradually. His injuries from the battle with Gu Xingyun had not yet healed, but he had broken through from the stabilization phase of the Thundershocking Realm to the peak of the Thundershocking Realm, and his injuries had been completely suppressed. With a sword in hand, Lin Yuxian thought of the martial arts that Li Tianlan had told him before. Such martial arts had no choice, no so-called path, no light and darkness, and no reality and illusion. Martial arts was martial arts. His martial arts was swordsmanship. That was swordsmanship. The simplest martial arts, the simplest swordsmanship, were also the most difficult. Invincible martial arts, invincible swordsmanship. Such martial arts did not need a path, so there was no need to choose. Therefore Lin Yuxian made up his mind when he broke through. He did not need to choose anything. He had his own swordsmanship, so he still chose the 24 moves of sword. Lin Yuxian's figure walked to the foot of the mountain. Countless coalition forces appeared in his sight. Lin Yuxian narrowed his eyes and relaxed. The crazy sword intent suddenly spread with him as the center. The taut soft sword swept across the grass. The sword intent gradually turned into a storm. He chose the 24 moves of sword. One day, it would become his own 24 moves of sword. Lin Yuxian clenched the hilt of the sword and suddenly spun. A violent storm suddenly rose at the foot of the mountain. The eighth blade, burning sky. Lin Yuxian's body spun wildly and rushed directly to the top of the mountain with the rotating sword light from the foot of the mountain. The storm turned into a hurricane. With a loud whistling sound that resounded throughout the battlefield, it came down from above. Lin Yuxian's figure had disappeared. The sword intent had disappeared. There was only a crazy and almost completely out of control storm left on the entire battlefield. Wherever the storm passed, boulders and grass rushed into the sky. The whole mountain trembled violently under the storm. The mountain was completely torn apart by the storm and began to collapse. Finally, it was swept into the storm. The entire mountain seemed to have flown up under this sword. This was just a sword, but it was like an eternal sword. The storm formed by the sword light tore the mountain peak and rushed into the crowd while the earth was shaking. Bloody rain and wind. It was just like what they had predicted. The charge of the Snowdance Corps. Yi's arrow. His sword. This battle was enough. Wulan State, August 7th. At 4:50 p.m. The 30,000-strong coalition forces of Wulan State, Oga State, and Ross State encountered the 3,000 Snowdance Corps on the border of Wulan State. At 5:25 p.m., the 30,000-strong coalition forces completely lost their combat effectiveness and completely collapsed. In half an hour, the 3,000 Snowdance Corps went in and out of the 30,000-strong coalition forces 3 times and completely broke up the last trace of combat effectiveness of the coalition forces. At 5:40 p.m., the elites of the Snowdance Corps officially entered Wulan State and went straight to Reki City. And at this time, it had been 12 hours since Li Tianlan caused a great change in Reki City. I didn't update yesterday. I sent a leave notice. As expected, many people couldn't see it if I posted it there. I changed to a new computer. I was too late yesterday to work on the computer, so I didn't write it. The input method was gone. It was estimated that there would be a lot of typos recently, and it was the end of the year. There were a lot of things to do. I'll ask for leave as little as possible. I'll be fine after the Spring Festival. Chapter 430. Among the 4 major families in Eastern Europe, the Rekvia family was recognized as the weakest. It could only dominate the base camp in Eastern Europe, and its sphere of influence had always been difficult to go out of Eastern Europe. In contrast, the other 3 major families in Eastern Europe, Morton, Violet, and the Qin family, may not be much stronger than Rekvia in Eastern Europe, but outside Eastern Europe, their strong capital would not be much weaker than theirs in Eastern Europe. The main reason for this embarrassing situation was that the Rekvia family did not have its own invincible realm expert. When the Polar Ground Alliance existed, as one of the 4 pillar families of the Polar Ground Alliance, Rekvia's shortcoming of lacking high-end combat power had been intentionally or unintentionally covered. With the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, the most fatal flaw of the entire Rekvia was completely exposed in an instant. In such a state, the Rekvia family, in the eyes of enemies of the same level, was completely like a beast with a body but no sharp claws. The deterrent might still be there, but the overall combat effectiveness had fallen to the lowest point. The Morton family had its own invincible realm expert. The Violet family also had it. The Qin family also had it. The Rekvia family had what was known as the strongest war fortress in Eastern Europe, the Rekvia Castle. The entire Rekvia family built their castle at all costs. They used the most advanced scientific defense system to make up for the lack of an invincible realm expert in their family. From another point of view, in the heart of the Rekvia family, their castle should be equivalent to an invincible realm expert, at least not much worse. The most advanced defense system, the most accurate firepower coverage, and enough experts to maintain the operation of the castle, the entire Rekvia castle could be said to have almost no dead spots. This was the battlefield Li Tianlan chose. Maybe it was not the most perfect, but in Eastern Europe, in Wulan State, and in Reki City, this was already the best battlefield he could find. The Jiang family of South America would not retreat. Li Tianlan could only use everything in the castle to face Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost. The entire castle trembled under the tremendous force. The moment Jiang Qiansong chose to move forward, the curtains of the stalemate were lifted. All the defense and offensive systems in the Rekvia castle began to run. From a distance, the entire castle seemed to be glowing. With a super high temperature, it was enough to destroy everything. Lasers shot out from all corners of the castle. Beams of changing colors intertwined into a light curtain, shining in front of the castle door. Jiang Qiansong was still moving forward. With him as the center, the space in front of the castle had completely solidified into an absolute defensive field. The field of the 30-meter mortal world became extremely dark around him, and the space completely condensed into a hole. In front of the castle, a precious energy was burning. The surging lasers kept hitting the solidified space. A large piece of the solidified space rippled like water, but there was no sign of it shattering. In terms of real combat power, Jiang Qiansong was not at the top of the divine list. But in terms of defense, he was definitely the best in the world. Forward. 30-meter mortal world, iron wall. Endless lasers shook the domain around Jiang Qiansong. Black Ghost followed Jiang Qiansong without leaving his side. The castle's main gate was getting closer and closer to them. Jiang Qiansong raised his head and stared at Li Tianlan, who was standing at the top of the castle. Li Tianlan lowered his head and calmly looked down at Jiang Qiansong. His body stood at the highest point of the castle, as steady as a rock. Another 5 meters. Watching Jiang Qiansong pushing the domain forward, Li Tianlan thought quietly. Another 5 meters. Looking at Li Tianlan above the castle, Jiang Qiansong was also thinking. 5 meters was very short. But in the countless destructive lasers flying, it was so long. The more he went forward, the more lasers there were, and the denser the frequency was. Jiang Qiansong, who was moving forward against the lasers, looked more and more serious. 30-meter mortal world was really close to 9 meters. The dark domain with a radius of 30 meters was constantly fluctuating under the impact of the lasers, looking vague and messy. Black Ghost's thick arm trembled slightly, and he held the black knife in his hand. A deep darkness comparable to the night continued to spread in his hands, and eventually covered his whole body. An extremely sharp and terrifying killing intent surged within the domain. 5 meters. This was also his best attack distance. Both were 5 meters. Forward. 4 meters. Jiang Qiansong's face became completely dignified. Black Ghost's figure was completely hidden in the dark knife light. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes and took a step forward calmly. 3 meters. The breeze and drifting clouds of Sai City appeared above the castle. 2 meters. All the experts of the Rekvia family were ready. Jiang Qiansong took a deep breath. 1 meter. Li Tianlan suddenly took a step forward. 1 step, 1 meter. The moment the distance was shortened by him, the whole castle seemed to become extremely illusory. Jiang Qiansong's last step fell. The domain of the 30-meter mortal world suddenly expanded. 30-meter mortal world moon in the mirror. The densest lasers fell on his domain. The expanded domain collapsed inwardly for a moment, and then swelled up again. The domain was moving forward. Countless lasers that fell on the domain bounced back to the castle at the same time. The castle really existed. But in everyone's perception, it seemed to have disappeared like an illusion. An illusory but clear sword intent blocked the way in front of the castle. The bounced laser passed through the sword intent. Li Tianlan's body suddenly shook. But the power in the domain and the power of the laser began to dissipate. After brewing for a long time, the long darkness rushed out of Jiang Qiansong's domain. In the incomparably arrogant roar, the darkness was like a knife. The light between heaven and earth completely converged with Black Ghost's knife. Black Ghost's long knife was raised high. In the almost lightless night, a pitch-black giant blade with a length of hundreds of meters suddenly appeared. The giant blade chopped down wildly. Cool breeze and drifting clouds. All the experts of the Rekvia family took action at the same time. The lasers were still shooting. Thunderbolts and flames soared in the air, with great power to meet the flash of knife light. Li Tianlan's eyes narrowed again. He knew the result of this collision. But there was no time to remind anything. Large pieces of thunderbolts and flames were compatible with the knife light. The darkness spread all the way. The light was obliterated all the way in the dark knife light. Li Tianlan opened his mouth, but he only had time to say one word. Retreat. Boom. His voice was completely drowned out by the loud noise in an instant. The pitch-black giant blade in the air suddenly suppressed all the thunderbolts and flames, and the crazy knife directly slashed on the castle. This was a full blow by an invincible realm expert who gave up defense in order to pursue the strongest attack power. Black Ghost's strongest blow. This knife was called Annihilation. Except for Jiang Qiansong, no one and nothing could stop this blow. Li Tianlan couldn't stop it. The castle couldn't stop it either. Boom. The dirt flew all over the sky, and a huge crack suddenly appeared on the front gate of the huge castle under the knife light. In the horrified eyes of countless people, the entire wall on one side of the castle was completely shattered by this knife. A quarter of the exquisite and strong castle defense was directly destroyed under this knife. The castle became ugly and no one could care about it. The simplest question in front of everyone. The castle gate had been completely broken. Outside the door, there were two invincible realm experts of hostile forces standing at this time. This was the simplest question, and the most fatal one. Jiang Qiansong's domain once again wrapped Black Ghost. He raised his head and glanced up. Li Tianlan still stood there, calm and collected. Jiang Qiansong smiled and said calmly, "I'm coming to kill you." Li Tianlan was in a trance. He still remembered what he said to Jiang Qianyan more than 10 hours ago. Then Jiang Qianyan died. And now karma? Li Tianlan sneered. He didn't bother to think about the so-called karma. This was the current situation. He couldn't retreat. So even in the face of two invincible realm experts, the only thing he could do was to take action. Fight to the death. Chapter 431. No matter how advanced a dead thing was, it was not as good as a flexible expert. The gate of Rekvia's castle, known as the strongest war fortress in Eastern Europe, was completely shattered in a full charge by two invincible realm experts. Although such a situation was not a desperate situation, the pressure at that moment was like a dark cloud covering the sky, shrouding everyone's heart. It was still raining. The patter of rain swallowed the gloomy light. The sky gradually changed from day to night. The solemn atmosphere froze everyone's expression. From the top to the bottom of the castle, everyone looked dignified. Tostel stood in the command room in the center of the castle, and his whole body was completely tense. As the usurper of the Rekvia family, this was the time when he was closest to success, but it was also the most dangerous time. All of this depended on the outcome between Li Tianlan and the Jiang family of South America, and the winner's final choice. All the weapons in the castle were ready. As Jiang Qiansong moved forward, the automatic system accurately locked Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost. Jiang Qiansong moved forward slowly, his pace calm and relaxed. There were still experts of Rekvia who survived in front of the collapsed gate of the castle. As Jiang Qiansong moved forward, Rekvia's thunder-shocking realm experts and fire-flaming realm experts retreated in large numbers. Li Tianlan still stood at the top of the castle, squinting at this scene without saying a word. In the command room, Tostel took a deep breath and slowly said, "Fire!" Jiang Qiansong could not move. He moved forward step by step. This was coercion. Li Tianlan could not move. Time was on his side and he also had a lot of time to choose. But Tostel had to move. Standing here he had no way out. He chose Li Tianlan and Zhongzhou State. Such a choice meant that he had to at least make some actions in line with his current position. He really didn't like the Jiang family of South America, especially after the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance. Without the deterrence of the Invincible Realm, facing the ambitious Jiang family of South America, Rekvia could hardly see any living space in the future. And Li Tianlan had a good chance of winning. Tostel firmly believed that. Fire. It was heavy and clear. He repeated it again. As long as he helped Li Tianlan win this victory, Rekvia would be on the big ship of Zhongzhou State. It would get more than just a chance to breathe. Perhaps it would be even more glorious in the future. Compared with being annexed by the Jiang family of South America, that prospect was definitely worth Tostel's fight. The Rekvia executives in the command room were still hesitating. Tostel, who had made up his mind, walked over and pressed the button to activate all the weapons in the castle. An ear-piercing alarm suddenly rang throughout the entire castle. Jiang Qiansong stepped into the castle. Lasers filled the sky and exploded in every corner of the castle. Boom. Creak. Amidst the dull sound, the entire huge ancient castle began to slowly change. The wall closest to Jiang Qiansong was shaking violently. The walls in all directions were slowly squeezed in by the flying lasers. The entire structure of the ancient castle began to slowly deform. After discarding some of the complicated but useless buildings, the entire ancient castle looked increasingly sharp and sinister. Li Tianlan watched all this quietly. His palm moved slowly. Falling stars gradually turned into a silver blade, and he held it tightly in his hand. The field of 30-meter mortal world opened up around Jiang Qiansong. Jiang Qiansong was expressionless as he threw a punch at the walls that were pressing in from all directions without hesitation. An earth-shattering explosion sounded without warning. The squeezed wall encountered a huge force and directly triggered the self-destruction system. The violent explosion stagnated for a moment outside the field of 30-meter mortal world, and then the intense fire completely swallowed Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost. The raging fire madly impacted the field of 30-meter mortal world with the impact of the explosion. The moment the fire suddenly covered him, Jiang Qiansong raised his head subconsciously. In his sight, the place where Li Tianlan had stood was empty. Jiang Qiansong's heart sank slightly. The entire castle seemed to move completely at the moment of the explosion. The muzzles of lasers in all corners of the castle turned at the same time. Countless lasers gathered on a huge stone ball in the center of the castle. The stone ball, which seemed to be casually placed in the open air of the castle as a decoration, suddenly rotated in the convergence of the lasers. The converging lasers continued to intertwine and spread around the rotating stone ball, and eventually intertwined into a light curtain with a terrifying high temperature. All the light seemed to lose all its destructive power in the blink of an eye, but the high temperature continued to condense, sweeping everything around it. There was only high temperature. The terrifying extreme high temperature covered Jiang Qiansong's field before the sound of the explosion fell, and then rushed past the back of Jiang Qiansong's field. The light curtain continued to spread. Along the way, the field of 30-meter mortal world quickly melted away, and outside the field, half of the castle was completely shattered by this blow. The vast thunderbolt directly covered the moment the light curtain passed. Cool breeze and drifting cloud. All the masters of the Rekvia family made a full effort at the same time. This was the weakest time of the field of 30-meter mortal world. It was also the best time to hit Jiang Qiansong hard. No one expected that Rekvia's laser weapons would be so terrifying. Similarly, no one could expect that the self-destruction device in Rekvia's castle would have such a powerful destructive power. Even the Rekvia family itself did not expect it. This was known as the strongest war fortress in Eastern Europe. But since the establishment of the castle, it was the first time it had experienced the flames of war. All the laser weapons exhausted all the energy at one time, destroying half of the castle, but at the same time, it also suppressed Jiang Qiansong's field to the lowest point. The dim light of the 30-meter mortal world was in the soaring fire. The light and messy light curtain flickered constantly. Large thunderbolts immediately covered it. The light filled everything. In the chaotic light and shadow, Jiang Qiansong's angry roar suddenly sounded. The thunderbolts were spreading. The light curtain was spreading. The flickering 30-meter mortal world quietly blended into a dark blade light. The whole field seemed to become dark in the knife light. The darkness permeated the light curtain and kept twisting. 30-meter mortal world, stealing the sky for changing the sun. Stealing the sky for changing the sun, borrowing strength and momentum. With Black Ghost's full cooperation, the dark knife light and the field of 30-meter mortal world were almost completely integrated together. Jiang Qiansong was strong in defense. Black Ghost was strong in attack. This style of stealing the sky for changing the sun was enough to fully combine all the advantages of the two. Such a power could even make Jiang Qiansong continuously advance several ranks on the divine list. The knife light and the field that were integrated into one broke out wildly. The space was completely broken in an instant. In the night that fell in a trance, a layer of gray ripples visible to the naked eye appeared in the space. The destructive explosion and the dense thunderbolts were all absorbed by the gray space ripples. It became a dark field that swept through all the destructive forces. The whole world appeared in front of Jiang Qiansong's eyes. But what appeared in front of him was not the castle. It was the most real world that was separated from the illusion. The most real, the quietest, the most vast, and the smallest. The whole world began to shrink in absolute silence. There was no sound, no scenery, and no night in the night. In a trance, misty, but extremely real world, there was only one sword light. The forever silent world. Jiang Qiansong remembered the final maneuver of Zhongzhou State. In the final maneuver, he had seen this style and had vaguely tried to capture that trace of sword intent. But at this moment, the forever silent world that appeared in front of him was completely different from what he had seen before. This style of forever silent world was actually just a starting move. The silver sword light was lifted up little by little in the absolutely quiet world. The sword light was extremely bright. But the sword edge seemed extremely heavy. Li Tianlan held the sword as if he was holding the whole world. This sword was not a sword that belonged to his martial arts. At least not before today. So when this sword appeared in front of Jiang Qiansong, he suddenly felt very familiar. This was the sword that Li Tianlan had been thinking about. He had not yet grasped the essence of this sword, so this sword was not the strongest. But it was the most suitable. This sword originated from Zhongzhou State's sword emperor, Wang Tianzong. It originated from his sword that set off a 10,000-meter sword intent at the intersection of the Pacific Ocean and the Arctic Ocean that day. This was a sword that he simulated in his constant thinking. He started with the forever silent world. This style. It was called the Long Rainbow. Chapter 432. Jiang Qiansong watched Li Tianlan draw the sword. The blade of falling stars shone with a sharpness that could dispel the night. The forever silent world started. This sword was neither fast nor slow, but it gave people a feeling that it could not be dodged. The world was silent. Extreme silence was nothingness. Nothingness was reality. The sword light on the blade of falling stars was also very real. It was a real boundless world. In the boundless illusory sword intent, everything was not relative. It was not relative to speed, nor was it relative to slow. That sword was there. Fast or slow had no meaning. Only the most realistic and illusory sword seemed to exist eternally. The forever silent world, Long Rainbow. The long rainbow in the night was full of light for thousands of miles. The silver sword light enveloped the falling star sword, swallowed Li Tianlan, and covered the castle. The extremely dazzling sword light became brighter and brighter. Jiang Qiansong's pupils lost Li Tianlan's shadow. The night came again after the absolutely dazzling light. The light still existed, but it was extremely condensed in an instant. The infinite light shrank together, getting brighter and brighter, but getting smaller and smaller. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow. The whole world became a battlefield of light and darkness. Everything around seemed to have completely disappeared. A boundless light that seemed to cover the world finally completely condensed on the blade of falling stars. Jiang Qiansong's pupils suddenly contracted to the extreme. In the darkness, the dazzling and almost brilliant sword light began to extend. The light was extremely small, but the brightness was absolutely blazing. Li Tianlan, Jiang Qiansong, Black Ghost. Falling stars, 30-meter mortal world, dark sword light. Everything seemed to be connected by this extremely heavy and bright sword light. Speed, distance, even time had completely lost its meaning. Jiang Qiansong quietly stared at the sword light in the darkness. He didn't know how long it had been. At the moment when the sword intent lit up, time no longer flowed relative, and speed no longer played a relative role. Everything was relative, and everything was not relative. This was Li Tianlan's full-strength sword in his peak state. Where the sword intent spread, it was not so much a domain, but a world. A world that made Jiang Qiansong completely strange. He couldn't adapt to the reality of this world. He still preferred the world that everyone knew. In the world that everyone lived in, time flowed relative to each other. Fast was faster than slow, slow was slower than fast. Light was rising relative to falling. Darkness was rising relative to falling. Forward was moving forward relative to retreating, and backward relative to advancing relative to retreating. Even if time was still, it was still relative to advancing and retreating. It was a world where all things were relative. At this moment, in the absolute silence of the void, an instant seemed like an eternity. Fast was slow, slow was fast. In the void, there were no living things, and there were no opposites. Reality and illusion. So, was this sword real or just an illusion? Jiang Qiansong could not adapt to such a world. Therefore, when the sword light shone, when the sword light converged, when the sword light spread, from the beginning to the end, he did not react at all. If all things did not oppose each other, then any reaction would no longer have any meaning. Jiang Qiansong's eyes were in a trance. In absolute silence and nothingness, this sword strike had brought him terror. What was left was shock and a hint of indistinct understanding. What was a prodigy? Only those who had absolute dominance in an era could be called Heaven's chosen one. Those who could lead the progress of martial arts in an era could be called Heaven's chosen one. Hundreds of years ago, the prodigy ancestor of the Wang family of Beihai, and the ancestor of the Lin clan shocked the world in their most glorious period. From that time on, the Dark World had the 4 realms of martial arts and the Invincible Realm. Today, hundreds of years later, in this sword strike, Jiang Qiansong vaguely seemed to see the possibility of surpassing the Invincible Realm. The darkness continued to spread. The sword light on the blade of falling stars began to spread forward. It did not bloom. The light was condensed to the extreme and spread straight. It was like a ray of light that broke the night curtain. A long rainbow. It was very small, but it was extremely brilliant and gorgeous. It was not a sword strike that covered everything. This sword was an extremely condensed point. The tiny light traversed the sky, tore the night curtain, and almost ignored the space. The sword light converged into a line and pierced the 30-meter mortal world domain filled with dark saber light. There was no difference between weak and strong. This was an absolutely condensed but very casual sword strike. It did not matter if it was pierced at any point, because he firmly believed in the sharpness of his sword strike. Indestructible. Indestructible. This was the first time since Li Tianlan had determined his path and achieved the basic level of martial arts that he used his sword with all his strength. He was unprecedentedly focused and dignified. At all costs, the great power moved forward with pure sword intent. Eternity was like a moment. Li Tianlan's body was stretched to the limit in an instant. The bones pulled the muscles, and the muscles tore the blood vessels. Blood came out of his body all over. A faint cracking sound seemed to ring in his body. Li Tianlan spat out a mouthful of blood, and a vein in his body that was difficult to grasp seemed to be unable to bear the force of this sword strike and broke inch by inch. The next moment, the brilliant sword light condensed to the extreme suddenly flew out and fell on Jiang Qiansong's domain. The domain in the darkness was silent for a moment. The expressions on the faces of Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost were completely frozen. In the next second, an earth-shattering noise suddenly resounded through the mountains and fields. The domain and the sword light were completely broken. The whole space completely collapsed and exploded. The empty and quiet void spread in the chaotic power. The 30-meter mortal world and the dark saber light disappeared completely. Only the light still existed, so real, so sharp. Forward. Forward with indomitable will. The light was like a column. From the light to a column of light. The sword intent had begun to disperse. But the residual power of this sword still carried a murderous aura that was enough to tear everything. This was a young edge that had never appeared in Zhongzhou State, or even the entire Dark World for hundreds of years. A sword proud of the world. The residual power of the sword light was mighty. Black Ghost instinctively came to Jiang Qiansong's side. But he didn't stand in front of him. Instead, he hid behind Jiang Qiansong. Jiang Qiansong raised his arm. At this moment, almost all his defensive means were useless. Rekvia's castle burned all the energy to make the laser weapon burst out completely at one time. Countless masters attacked at the same time, and all the forces were obliterating his domain. At the moment when his domain was at its weakest, Li Tianlan directly drew his sword. Thousands of miles of rainbow. Even he could hardly react to the sword light that extended forward in an instant. He couldn't count on Black Ghost. Although Black Ghost was also in the invincible realm, he was in the invincible realm who gave up all the defense power. In the face of this sword, even if it was just the residual power, it was enough to kill him. The only thing Jiang Qiansong could do was barely raise his arm. He grasped the metal plate in his palm. The metal plate suddenly opened at the moment when the sword light pierced over, turning into a shield that could protect the vital parts of his upper body. The shield shone instantly in the face of the condensed sword light. Jiang Qiansong raised the shield to meet it. The sword light and the shield touched. What sounded was not the sound of collision, but a clear sound of breaking. The shield that could make Jiang Qiansong carry with him was almost completely torn apart by the sword light in an instant. The sword light, which was so subtle that it was hard to detect, passed through Jiang Qiansong's arm. Jiang Qiansong's body shook violently, and a large amount of blood burst out of his whole arm. Jiang Qiansong's face was a little pale, and his bloody arm trembled slightly. He raised his head and looked at Li Tianlan. Without the illumination of the sword light, Li Tianlan looked extremely illusory in the darkness. His face was also pale, and there was a trace of blood at the corner of his mouth. But in a trance, Jiang Qiansong suddenly felt that Li Tianlan in this state was calmer than before. Li Tianlan took a step forward. His eyes were pure and focused. There was only the craziest killing intent. Jiang Qiansong took a deep breath and suddenly made up his mind. In the current situation, he had a lot of choices. For example, he suppressed Li Tianlan, let Black Ghost kill the masters of Cool Breeze, Drifting Cloud and Rekvia, and finally killed Li Tianlan and re-cooperated with Rekvia. Or let Black Ghost collide with Li Tianlan, and he destroyed the entire castle by himself. Or, there were many possibilities. They were not easy, but there was a chance of success. But at this moment, Jiang Qiansong suddenly gave up all the plans. His eyes were a little annoyed, but he eventually calmed down and became very firm. Because things had come to this point, he suddenly found that many things were meaningless. Li Tianlan and the Jiang family of South America had a deep cause and effect. And Li Tianlan, not to mention the future, even now it was a little terrifying. Jiang Qiansong had a certain degree of certainty to win this game, but he and Black Ghost separated, but he had no certainty to keep Li Tianlan. If Li Tianlan was alive, even if the Jiang family of South America regained the right to cooperate with Rekvia, and even won the chaos in Eastern Europe, what was the point? Of course at that time, Li Tianlan might be very miserable. But Jiang Qiansong was not sure that Li Tianlan would die in that state. After all, there was Samsara Palace behind him. There were even a large number of forces in Zhongzhou State that supported him. Li Tianlan did not die. The future of the Jiang family of South America was the end of the world. This was the simplest logic. All the twists and turns in Jiang Qiansong's mind became clear and straight in an instant. He looked at Li Tianlan and spoke slowly. "Agui." Black Ghost responded and walked to Jiang Qiansong's side. "Come with me," Jiang Qiansong said in a low voice. "Kill him." This was Jiang Qiansong's decision. The interests after annexing the Rekvia family. The prospects after winning the chaos in Eastern Europe. Everything disappeared from Jiang Qiansong's mind at this moment. It did not matter. But at the moment he had a more important goal. This trip to Eastern Europe. Even if the Jiang family of South America would fail, or even get nothing in the end, it was acceptable. As long as he killed Li Tianlan, this would be the biggest gain of the Jiang family of South America's trip to Eastern Europe, even better than the cooperation with Rekvia. So at this moment, what Jiang Qiansong wanted was more than just victory. What he wanted most was Li Tianlan's life. At all costs. It's the Spring Festival recently, so the number of words in each chapter is very small. Even half a chapter at a time. There are too many things. It's normal after the annual meeting. Now write less. At present, if I can keep updating, I will be very satisfied. Chapter 433. Jiang Qiansong had used his own actions to prove what it meant to risk everything. In the deep night, the sword intent had not completely dispersed. The ruptured space was still spreading, and the space was filled with twisted dark ripples. The ripples still carried a destructive power, destroying everything in their path unscrupulously. Half of the castle had already collapsed. Light leaked out and shone in the darkness. In the chaotic brilliance, everything in the surroundings became extremely blurry. Jiang Qiansong's voice seemed to shatter in the distorted space. But Black Ghost, who was very close to him, clearly heard Jiang Qiansong's order. Without any hesitation, he raised the jet-black dagger in his hand. But Jiang Qiansong was faster than him. Before his voice died away, he had already pounced on Li Tianlan. At this moment, it seemed that all interests and prospects were not as important as killing Li Tianlan for Jiang Qiansong. Black Ghost followed closely behind. The two invincible realm experts charged at the same time. The saber light and the domain emanated an overwhelming pressure. Li Tianlan's expression was still calm, but under the illumination of the pervasive light of the domain, his face was strangely pale. No one knew what kind of price he had to pay for that 10,000 miles rainbow. Even Li Tianlan himself did not know whether such a sacrifice was good or bad. Thousands of miles of rainbow broke the domain maintained by Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost, and at the same time destroyed Jiang Qiansong's life-saving shield. The most powerful sword attack almost broke the dual wind and thunder veins in his body. The dual wind and thunder veins were still in his body, but the speed and strength he could exert had been greatly suppressed. It seemed to have returned to the standard of the normal wind and thunder veins. This wasn't a good thing. However, temporarily losing the dual wind and thunder veins meant that he had lost some of his speed and strength, but at the same time, his weakness of not being able to balance his strength, speed, and willpower was infinitely reduced. With the normal wind and thunder veins, Li Tianlan was calmer than before. However, this moment of calmness was completely shattered when Jiang Qiansong pounced over. The entire Dark World knew that Jiang Qiansong was famous for his defense. But as an invincible realm expert on the divine list, no matter how bad his attack power was, it was still at the invincible realm level. The 30-meter mortal world condensed around him. Jiang Qiansong's speed was as fast as a phantom. Countless shadows suddenly filled Li Tianlan's sight. In Li Tianlan's eyes, Jiang Qiansong was still charging. The other party's tightly clenched fist had already smashed over. Jiang Qiansong's 30-meter mortal world was infinitely close to the real 30-meter mortal world. 9 zhang. Almost 30 meters. Jiang Qiansong punched out, and all the power belonging to the invincible realm poured wildly in the space with a radius of 30 meters. It was just like Li Tianlan's 10,000-mile rainbow. The pure 30-meter mortal world, which had shrunk to the extreme, was Jiang Qiansong's world. When he punched out, there was only power in his world. All the power erupted hysterically in the space within a radius of 30 meters. The mighty destructive power hit the edge of the domain and rolled back, repeating over and over again, tyrannical like a tide. In Jiang Qiansong's world, this punch was enough to destroy the world. 30-meter secular world, Armageddon. Li Tianlan had nowhere to retreat in the violent power that was like a storm and a wave. This was Jiang Qiansong's domain. The world was huge. But now, these 30 meters belonged to Jiang Qiansong. And it was also all that Li Tianlan could feel. He stepped forward. Forward. Li Tianlan's movements were extremely stretched, and the vibration of countless joints turned from a soft sound to a high sound, like a dragon. but he held the hilt of falling stars tightly in his hand. Dragon Fist, Azure Dragon Arrow. Shattering Style. The unique skill of the Li family. His own martial arts. For a while they were completely integrated. Only those who had really understood the Li family's inheritance and had their own martial arts could combine the two unique skills so perfectly. Dragon Fist, Azure Dragon Arrow. The beginning of Dragon Fist. This was the first move of the 72 styles of Dragon Fist. Under this punch, he sought the most fierce and penetrating power. And Li Tianlan's own shattering style also condensed the power into one point. In the domain of the 30-meter mortal world, he could not overturn Jiang Qiansong's world, but he could try his best to tear a gap that could let him breathe in this world with the slightest but most fierce sword intent. The night was extremely quiet. Li Tianlan stabbed forward with his sword. The moment the sword intent broke out, Jiang Qiansong's mighty punch with great power had directly smashed over. The violent power and the condensed sword intent surged at the same time within the range of tens of meters, but silently. The real battle of the invincible realm had long lost the gorgeous scene of surging flames when experts of the thunder-shocking realm fought. There was only the most direct, the most dangerous, and also the simplest collision. There was no sound, but it was earth-shattering in an instant. The fierce sword intent collided with the endless power domain. The space within 30 meters around Jiang Qiansong suddenly fluctuated violently. The air was constantly twisting. In a blur, everyone could vaguely see the shadows of Li Tianlan and Jiang Qiansong. Li Tianlan moved forward with his sword. Jiang Qiansong no longer clenched his fists. He put his palms together and calmly clamped the blade of Li Tianlan's sword with both hands. The sword intent gradually became sparse, but the violent power was still surging. It was like a confrontation or a stalemate for a moment. Li Tianlan held the blade tightly and stepped forward. Jiang Qiansong stepped forward at the same time. Boom! The sound of the space exploding suddenly sounded between the long sword and the palms put together. The flying sword intent and the power domain roaring like a storm were completely out of control in an instant. The entire domain that was flickering with a gloomy luster became completely clear in an instant. The condensed sword intent began to disappear. The domain had a clear shape. A faint wall of light suddenly appeared in front of Jiang Qiansong. The light wall pressed forward and covered Li Tianlan's body. Jiang Qiansong's body trembled slightly, and then he was motionless. Li Tianlan's body shook violently, and at the same time his whole body flew backward for tens of meters and smashed into an open-air flower bed in the castle. The flower bed completely collapsed, and the branches, leaves, and flowers were crushed in the impact. Li Tianlan's body, which fell to the ground, moved. Before he could stand up, the black knife light had come across the sky and swept directly to his head. Jiang Qiansong strode forward. The invincible realm expert on the divine list, who was famous for his defense, was in an all-out offensive posture at this time. He and Black Ghost were on the left and right. They didn't even give Li Tianlan half a second to breathe. As soon as the attack ended, a more fierce attack had come. The black knife light was like a thunderbolt that tore the world apart, and the light with killing intent condensed into a round arc of light in the air. The arc of light went from top to bottom, and the knife cut directly to Li Tianlan. Jiang Qiansong's attack followed closely. His attack power was not as good as Black Ghost's, but his power was extremely heavy and steady, like a surging river, continuous and endless. Li Tianlan lay on the ground and seemed to glance at the dark knife light. The knife light cut down like thunder and cut through Li Tianlan's body, but it seemed to cut in the air. The blade swept through Li Tianlan's body. Li Tianlan's figure gradually became faint and became a shadow. His figure reappeared in the place where he had just fought with Jiang Qiansong. Blood flowed down from his body, but his essence, qi, and spirit were still strong and abundant. Black Ghost and Jiang Qiansong stopped for a moment and looked back at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan was also looking at them. The scenery of this castle is very good. Jiang Qiansong said, "It's worth it for you to die here." At this time he had completely set his goal on Li Tianlan, and he temporarily ignored everything in Eastern Europe. In such a state of mind, they had two invincible realm experts. This was an overwhelming advantage. Jiang Qiansong's heart calmed down again. He really couldn't think of any reason why Li Tianlan could not die. Li Tianlan was silent. The current situation was obvious. Jiang Qiansong's attack power was indeed not strong. He could take the opponent's full blow, and he was injured but not killed, which was enough to prove that the opponent's attack power was really nothing compared to his defense. It was difficult for Jiang Qiansong to kill Li Tianlan now alone, but it was even more impossible for Li Tianlan to kill him. Black Ghost's defense was very poor. His defense absolutely could not stop Li Tianlan's full blow, but in the same way, Li Tianlan could not stop Black Ghost's full blow. Either one of these two invincible realm experts stood in front of Li Tianlan alone, and Li Tianlan would not be too embarrassed. It involved Jiang Qiansong. It was a fight to the death with Black Ghost. But if the two stood together, it was almost a fatal situation for Li Tianlan when their defense and attack were completely compensated. He couldn't beat them. He couldn't run away. Li Tianlan took a deep breath, and his eyes became colder. How do you want to die? Jiang Qiansong didn't want to delay time. As he spoke, he followed Black Ghost side by side again. Li Tianlan suddenly lowered his head. He raised his wrist and looked at the time. It was 6:40 p.m. When the sky in Zhongzhou State had just dimmed, Eastern Europe, which was also in summer, had ushered in the night. Li Tianlan laughed and said, "I want you to die first." You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.